The first strike of iron against iron rolled across the sagebrush before the sun had decided to rise. Three women on horseback slowed on the trail below Meadowlark Ridge and turned their heads toward the sound. What they found at the top was not a man mending a wagon, but a widow tearing one apart. She swung the hammer again, and another rotted board fell to the frost-bitten ground at her feet. Below her, the woman in the Sunday hat threw back her head and let out a laugh sharp enough to carry the whole length of the slope. The widow did not turn, did not flinch, did not lift her eyes from the rusted nail she was pulling free. Somewhere behind her stood the small cottonwood where she had buried her youngest daughter the previous March, and the ridge belonged to the very man whose wife was laughing. In 2 weeks she would be forced off this hill unless the wall she was building could hold what the coming winter meant to take. The first sound on Meadowlark Ridge that September morning of 1884 was not the wind coming down out of the Blue Mountains, not the far-off bell of somebody's stray cow wandering the flats below, not even the small hoarse cry of the red-tailed hawk that hunted the sage flats between the ridge and the Umatilla Road. The first sound was the flat, hard chime of a woman's hammer coming down on rusted iron one strike, and then another so early in the day that the pewter light had not yet decided whether to become morning at all. The sound carried. In empty country, the sound of one woman's work carries further than any preacher's voice, and every ranch hand on the trail below Meadowlark Ridge that hour turned in the saddle and looked up expecting to see a man mending a wagon before the roads closed for the season. What they saw instead was a widow taking one apart. Three riders slowed on the trail. They were women dressed in the good wool coats of women whose husbands had never asked them to count coin at a general store counter, and the middle rider who wore her Sunday hat on a Tuesday because her Sunday hat was the only hat she owned that a rancher's wife would recognize as authority put back her head and laughed. The laugh climbed the slope of the ridge and reached the widow at the top with the same clean carrying quality the hammer strike had reached the trail. The widow did not turn. She pulled one bent nail free, set it in the small tin at her feet, and drove the next one straight through the rotted board with three sharp motions that said more plainly than any answer she might have given that the laugh had been heard and considered and set aside as a matter of no immediate importance. Her name was Sigrun Alvestad. She was 34 years old. She had been born in a two-room cabin outside the small settlement of Bemidji in the north woods of Minnesota to parents who had themselves been born in cabins outside settlements smaller than that, and she had been raised on the plain gospel that a woman who cannot keep a stove burning through a February night has no business having children in the first place. She had married Halvard Alvestad at 20. She had followed him out to eastern Oregon in the spring of 1878 because he had heard the wheat country called Palouse was the last stretch of easy land a poor family could stake, and she had believed him because Halvard had never in the whole 8 years of their marriage said a word he had not first weighed for its truth. 3 winters ago, in the last week of the worst February the valley had ever recorded, Halvard had walked out into a storm to look for a stray heifer belonging to a neighbor and had not walked back. That was one part of the weight she carried. The other part sat under a small crooked cottonwood behind the rented cabin down in the valley, wrapped in the plain wooden box her husband's brother had made without being asked. Marit Alvestad, 2 years old at the end, buried the previous March in ground so cold it had taken 2 men most of a morning to open. Sigrun did not think about the small grave while she worked. Thinking about the small grave slowed her hands, and slow hands in September were the same thing as frozen children in January. She thought instead about the wagon under her hammer. It was an old sheep wagon, the kind the migratory herders had used up through the 70s before the country got fenced. The wheels were gone. The tongue had rotted where it met the frame. The canvas top had been taken off years back by whoever had abandoned the thing, and only the wooden ribs remained curving up against the sky like the exposed bones of some creature that had lain down on the ridge and given up. It was by any honest reckoning not fit to be called a wagon anymore. It was in the eye of a woman who had grown up with her grandmother's stories the beginning of something else. Below her, the middle rider gathered her reins and walked her horse 3 steps further up the trail so her voice would carry cleaner. Hetty Ashcroft leaned back against her cantle laughing still and offered the ridge her opinion. Ingrid Honey, that is a sheep wagon that has not moved since Grant was in office. What in the name of anything holy do you think you are doing to it? The name was wrong. Sigrun did not correct her. Hetty Ashcroft had lived 9 miles from the Alvestad claim for 4 years and had never once bothered to learn how the name was actually spoken, and correcting her now would have been the same as inviting her to keep offering opinions. Sigrun let the wrong name pass, and she pulled another board. The other two riders were with Hetty. On her right, on the tall bay mare that had cost her husband more than most claim shacks in the county, sat Millicent Thorncastle. She was the oldest of the three by 6 or 7 years, blonde, going toward the color of old cream, straight-backed, glove to the elbow, wearing pearls at 10 in the morning, because her husband owned most of what a person could see from the church steeple in Pendleton, and she considered it a wife's duty to display the fact. On Hetty's left, on a smaller gray sat Winifred Price, 24, married 18 months, still young enough to be uncertain whether she belonged in the company she was keeping. Winifred looked up at the widow on the ridge and did not laugh. Winifred looked down at her own hands on the reins, and something crossed her face that she did not have the courage to say aloud, and she turned her horse a quarter step so that she was not quite squared with the ridge anymore. Millicent Thorncastle spoke next. Her voice did not have Hetty's carrying laugh in it. Her voice had the flat certainty of a woman who had never in her adult life been contradicted on any subject she considered settled. "Building a house, Mrs. Alvestad. Is that what you are doing up there?" The pronunciation was correct. Millicent had bothered to learn. That was Sigrun would remember later, the first small crack in what she had assumed to be a solid wall. She turned. She did not smile. She looked down the slope at the three women on the three horses and offered, plain as a plank, the one true sentence available. "Yes, Mrs. Thorncastle, that is what I am doing." Silence. Then Hetty laughed again, sharper this time. "Out of a sheep wagon that has been sitting on a public rise for a decade. Out of what will amount come January to kindling with a stovepipe." The middle rider clicked her tongue. Her mare answered. The two others followed the mare, and the three horses moved together down the trail, the way horses move when the women on their backs have agreed without speaking that no further conversation is to be had. Only Winifred looked back once briefly before the shoulder of the ridge cut them from sight. Sigrun watched the road until the last dust from the last hoof had settled. Then she sat down on the pile of pulled boards. Then she put the flat of her hand against the frame of the wagon. Then she cried quiet without theatrics for the space of 1 minute exactly, because that was the length of time she could afford, and when the minute ended, she stood back up and drove the next nail out with 3 clean strikes and did not look at the trail again. There had been a March morning, 18 months before, that Sigrun kept in the specific compartment of her mind, reserved for things one does not open in daylight. She had opened it exactly twice since Marit's burial, once in the middle of an August night, when Tori had spiked a small ordinary summer fever, and Sigrun had sat by his pallet for 6 hours, convinced the compartment had opened itself, and once on a September afternoon when she had walked past the small, crooked cottonwood on her way to the well, and had not been able to make herself walk back the same way. She did not open it now, but the March morning stood behind her all the same, the way a person stands in a doorway you cannot see without turning your head, and the whole of the work she was doing on the ridge had its beginning in the exact words the old doctor had spoken in the leaking cabin at the bottom of the valley some 36 hours after Marit's small body had gone still under her hand. Dr. Silas Whitcomb had been the only medical man within a day's ride of the Palouse country for 19 years. He had delivered most of the children under 12 in 3 townships. He had lost some. He had told hard truths to enough mothers that he had learned to tell them without softening, because softening the words did not soften the winters, and the mothers deserved to know what the winters would take next. He had stood in the doorway of the rented cabin that morning with his hat in his hand, and he had looked at the ice on the inside of the north wall, and he had looked at Kirsten wheezing under her blanket by the small pour stove, and he had looked at Tory Blue around the mouth wrapped in his mother's shawl on the floor, and he had said without preamble, "Mrs. Alvestad, if you spend another winter in this house, the other 2 will not survive to see April." Sigrun had looked at him. She had not blinked. She had answered him with the one word available, "I know." He had waited for her to break. She had not broken. He had ridden away, and she had gone out to the field behind the cabin, and she had stood in the mud in the flat gray light, and she had spoken aloud to a daughter who could no longer hear her, "Marit, do you hear me? I will not lose them. Do you hear me? I will not." The wind had carried the words off. That was what wind was for. She had walked back into the cabin, and she had picked up the broom, and she had swept the floor, because a house that is being wept in still needs to be swept, and she had begun in the quiet part of her mind that never stopped working to think. The thinking had brought back Bemidji. That was the strange thing about the thinking. It had not brought back the cabin she was standing in, or the graveyard she had just come from, or the empty half of the bed where Halvard would never sleep again. It had brought back a small, hard palm against her own small palm, and a wall that was warm without any fire behind it, and a voice gentle and dry saying words a 7-year-old girl in an old woolen shawl had not been ready to understand. Grandmother Ragnhild. 1857, a January so cold the ink in Sigrun's father's inkwell had frozen at the kitchen table. Ragnhild had wrapped Sigrun in the shawl and had led her out through the drifted snow to the small, low cabin at the far edge of the settlement. The cabin the men laughed at because it looked more like a rise in the ground than a building. Inside it had been warm. Not fire warm. Warm the way a body is warm under the covers. Warm from all sides at once, a warmth that seemed to come out of the walls themselves. Ragnhild had pressed her granddaughter's small palm flat against the inner wall of that cabin and had held it there for a long moment, and she had offered the child the sentence Sigrun would carry through every one of the 27 winters that followed. Men build houses with fire, little one. Women build houses with patience. Sigrun had not understood. She had thought it a riddle. She had gone home. Ragnhild had died the following spring quietly in her own bed, without ever explaining further, because Ragnhild had believed that a truth you had to explain was a truth that would not stay believed. The knowledge had sat in Sigrun for 27 years, like a seed in a dry drawer, waiting for water. Marit's death was the water. She understood that now. She had understood it, in fact, standing in the mud in the March field, and every day since had been the slow, careful business of remembering exactly what her grandmother had shown her, one detail at a time, so that she would have the whole picture in her head before winter came around again. Meadowlark Ridge had come to her by accident. She had walked past it 100 times without seeing it, the way a woman walks past most things when she is carrying too much grief to lift her eyes. The wagon had been there through all those walks, its exposed ribs curving up above the sagebrush waiting. It was more or less on Barnaby Thorncastle's land, but the ridge itself was a small, useless rise not worth fencing, and the wagon had sat there so long even the Thorncastle ranch hands had stopped noticing it. Sigrun had noticed it on a Tuesday in the last week of August. She had been walking back from the Coburn place with a small bag of scrap wool Adeline Coburn's mother-in-law had pressed on her out of some vague neighborly instinct, and she had come up over the shoulder of the ridge and stopped and looked and set the bag of wool down and walked slowly around the wagon 3 times without touching it. Her hand had come to rest at last on the frame at the rear. The wood had been warm from the afternoon sun. The grain under her palm had felt strangely familiar, the way the grain of a chair one grew up sitting in. Feels familiar, and something inside her chest, something that had not moved in 18 months, had turned over once quiet like a sleeper adjusting to a better position. She had not known why. Standing on the ridge on that August afternoon, she had only known that the wagon was going to be a house, and that she was going to make it one, and that the how of it would arrive when it needed to. The how had begun to arrive within the week. She had gone to Bickford's General Merchandise in Pendleton on the following Saturday with the whole of the small leather purse Halvard had left her, the purse she had kept in the bottom of the flour barrel for 3 years without touching, and she had asked Elias Bickford for every pound of raw, greasy wool he could spare from his back room. Elias Bickford was 71 years old. He had known Halvard by name. He had liked him. He had watched Halvard's widow walk into his store on the March morning after Marit's burial, and he had watched her walk out again with a small paper twist of licorice for Tori that she had paid for out of the last coins in her apron pocket, and he had thought then that the woman was not going to be all right because he had seen enough widows to know the ones who were and the ones who were not. He had been wrong about her. That was, he decided, standing behind his counter that Saturday morning, a mistake he was pleased to have made. He asked no questions. He weighed the wool, wrote the sum, took the coins, and helped her carry the bundles out to the borrowed wagon at the hitching rail without any commentary at all. The bell above the shop door rang as they came back in. Millicent Thorncastle walked through it with her daughter Cyrilda, 12 years old, wide-eyed, holding her mother's hand. Millicent saw the bundles behind the counter. Millicent saw the coins on the counter. Millicent saw the widow at the far end of the aisle, dust of the wool still on her sleeves, and Millicent's face did the thing it did when it encountered a situation it had not been prepared for by any of its previous encounters. "Ingrid, dear, what in heaven's name?" Sigrun corrected the pronunciation, this time gentle Sigrun, Mrs. Thorncastle. "The name is Sigrun. It is a different vowel at the start." Millicent's mouth opened, then closed. Her daughter looked up at her mother's face with the puzzled attention of a child who has never seen that mouth uncertain of a sentence. Millicent recovered. Millicent always recovered. Are you buying all that filthy wool? Yes. Whatever for. Sigrun handed the smallest bundle to Kirsten, who had come up the aisle silent, as always, at her mother's elbow. Kirsten took the bundle. It was almost bigger than her, and she held it anyway. For a house, Mrs. Thorncastle. Millicent laughed. It was not Hetty's laugh. It was smaller, more considered a laugh that was choosing its size to be heard by exactly the audience it wished to hear it. Oh, my dear, my poor dear widow, are you meaning to spin yourself a house on that ridge above the flats? Sigrun handed the second bundle to Tori, who had been waiting by the front window. Tori took it in both arms. 7 years old, and he had already learned to hold doors and carry bundles for his mother in the specific manner of a small man who had noticed which grown men in the town would not. In Sigrun's chest hurt, with a specific familiar hurt, every time she saw him do it. She lifted the last bundle herself. She walked to the door. She paused there, one hand on the latch, and she turned back because Millicent Thorncastle deserved an answer, and Sigrun was not on principle going to walk away from an owed answer, however small. Mrs. Thorncastle, you have never touched a piece of raw wool in your life. Have you? Millicent blinked. Beg pardon. You have not carded it. You have not spun it. You have not washed the lanolin from your hands after a long day of it. I do not see what that has to do with anything. Then, Mrs. Thorncastle, you do not know what it does. Sigrun opened the door. Tori stepped through. Kirsten followed. Sigrun paused a second time. But you will, she offered, quiet, honest, without any heat in it at all. The bell rang. The door closed. Millicent Thorncastle stood in the middle of the store with her mouth slightly open. Elias Bickford behind his counter did not look up from his ledger, but the corner of his mouth moved a quarter of an inch, in a direction it had not moved in 9 or 10 years. He liked a store that was interesting. That store had just gotten interesting. The next 12 days on Meadowlark Ridge were the days that would later, when women told the story in kitchens up and down the valley, become the days when Sigrun Alvestad appeared to work without sleep. She slept. She slept in the pieces that a woman with 2 children and a race against September can sleep, which is to say in short, flat intervals, against whichever wall she had last leaned against. She rose in the dark. She heated coffee. She fed the children whatever the previous day's fire had left cooked. She walked the 1.5 miles from the rented cabin to the ridge with a lantern in one hand and a canvas sack of tools in the other. And Kirsten walked 1 step behind her, and Tori walked 1 step behind Kirsten, and none of them spoke on the walk because there was nothing that needed saying that would not be better said by getting to the ridge and beginning. She stripped the wagon down first. Every rotted board came off. Every rusted nail came out and went into the tin at her feet, to be straightened later by hammer against a flat stone, because a widow with a coin purse the size of hers did not throw away nails. The good frame beneath the oak ribs and the runner beams she kept. Halvard had once said that oak from good country was the only wood in America a man could trust with his life. She had not understood at the time why he had said it with such specific quiet. She understood now. She reinforced the ribs where they had softened. She replaced 2 of the runner beams with planks Elias Bickford had let her have at cost from a shipment meant for a barn that had never gotten built. She rebuilt the frame in 6 days, working from first light to last light, and often past it, and Kirsten learned during those 6 days to fetch and to pass and to hold, and Tori learned to sort nails by size and to run water from the small spring at the foot of the ridge, and neither child complained because neither child had any memory now of a mother whose face was not tight with a purpose they did not entirely understand, but had chosen without discussion to trust. On the 8th day, she began packing the walls. This was the work her grandmother had shown her a lifetime before, and Sigrun found to her quiet surprise that her hands remembered it without needing to be told. She took the raw, greasy wool still full of its dirt and its lanolin still smelling of the animal it had come from, and she carded it with a wire comb of her own devising until it lay flat and loose in her palm. She packed it handful by handful into the space between the inner wall of thin boards and the outer wall of thicker ones, working from the base up, pressing each handful firm but not tight. Because the trick of it, Ragnhild had said, was that the air trapped inside the wool did the actual holding of warmth, and packing the wool too tight was the same as building a chimney inside your own wall. Sigrun packed all around the wagon in a slow circle, and Kirsten packed beside her and Tori when he had run out of stones to sort pack the low places where their reach ran out. The lanolin worked into the cracks of Sigrun's fingers. It stung the first day. By the third day, it had begun to heal the cracks it had opened, which was one of the small kindnesses of the natural world Ragnhild had also mentioned once in passing 60 winters earlier. The finding came on the 14th day. It came the way important findings always come, in the middle of an unimportant task. Sigrun was prying up the rotted floorboards at the back wall of the wagon to reinforce the base, before the snow and under the third board from the rear, tucked flat between the joists in a way that no accidental drop could have produced, was a small rectangular bundle wrapped in oiled canvas. Sigrun's hand stopped over it. She knew that shape. She had wrapped things in oiled canvas herself, following the exact folding pattern her mother had used and her mother's mother before her, a folding pattern designed to keep books safe on the long journeys from one Minnesota settlement to another. She had more specifically watched Halvard wrap his own small Bible in exactly that pattern the day before their wedding, because a Bible was the only book most poor men owned, and Halvard had said then that he did not intend to let his to weather. She lifted the bundle out of the joist space. Her hands were shaking in a way they had not shaken since Dr. Whitcomb had stood in the doorway of the leaking cabin the previous March. She unwrapped the canvas one fold at a time. The Bible was small. Black leather, the corners worn soft as calfskin gloves. The gilt letters on the cover almost rubbed away from years of a pocket. Sigrun opened the front cover. Inside on the flyleaf in Halvard's careful, upright hand was written his own name, and a year Sigrun Alvestad, 1881. The year of the storm. The year he had walked out into the drift after the neighbor's heifer and had never walked back. She turned the flyleaf. There was more. There was writing that had not been on any page of any book she had ever seen him hold. Halvard had barely finished his English letters. He had preferred all his life the language of his own childhood kitchen, and he had left his own reading in that language to the small worn hymnal he had carried from Duluth. This English writing was slow. The letters leaned. Some of them were spelled the way a man spells English words when he is teaching himself out of a borrowed reader by lamplight and has no one to check his work. Sigrun read the passage once. She read it a second time. On the third time, her hand pressed flat against her mouth to hold the sound inside her. For Sigrun, if one day you find this, please know I love you more than my own life. There is a sickness in my chest. The doctor in Pendleton has told me its name. I do not want you to watch it take me. I do not want the children to remember me small. I have bought this wagon from Mr. Ackerman for $4. He does not want it. I have put it on the ridge above the flats where no one goes, where it will wait for you. It is oak. The frame is good. It will hold whatever you build onto it. If I do not come home, do not wait. Live. Live for the children. Live for yourself. The wagon is yours. It was always for you. Sigrun sat down on the wagon floor. The board she had been prying up rested across her lap. The Bible rested on top of the board. The oiled canvas lay in her hands. The light through the open doorway had moved without her noticing from white to gold to a deep red that would soon be dark. She did not move. She did not weep aloud. The weeping was quieter than that, the kind that has been waiting 3 years for permission to fall and does not now trust its own permission. Tears ran down her face, slow, one at a time, and she did not lift a hand to catch them. Halvard had known. 3 years ago, before the storm, before the heifer, before anything, the neighbors thought they knew about that February. Halvard had known. He had known that a sickness in his chest was going to kill him, and he had gone to Ackerman and bought this abandoned wagon for $4, and he had put it on this ridge, and he had wrapped his Bible in oiled canvas and hidden it under the floor with a letter to a wife he had loved enough to spare the sight of him growing small, and he had walked out into the February storm, not because the storm had taken him, but because the storm was the excuse the country would accept for what his own chest was doing anyway. He had gone somewhere. He had gone somewhere to die out of her sight. She did not yet know where. She did not in that hour need to know. What she knew was that the wagon under her had not been an accident, that her hand on the frame in August had not been random, that the whole of the summer's plan had been laid down for her by a dying man 3 winters before she had known she would need it, and that meant whatever else it meant, that she was not and had never been alone on this ridge. Kirsten found her there at dusk. The girl came up the 2 steps into the wagon holding a tin cup of water she had walked down to the spring to fetch, and she stopped in the doorway when she saw her mother sitting on the floor with the small black book in her lap and the wet on her face. Kirsten did not ask what the book was. Kirsten did not ask why her mother was crying. Kirsten had a specific gift. Her mother had not yet found a name for the gift of knowing which questions were owed an answer, at which hour, and this hour was not owed one. She crossed the wagon floor. She set the tin cup down beside her mother's knee. She sat down on the boards herself and laid her small warm shoulder against her mother's arm, and the two of them stayed there while the red light in the doorway thinned to gray, and the gray thinned to something that was not any color anymore. And after a long time, Sigrun spoke. "Kirsten, your father knew. He knew what mother. He knew we would come here. He knew we would find this." Kirsten was quiet for a moment. When she answered, her voice was the voice of a girl who had already decided a number of things about the shape of the world and required only occasional confirmation from grown people. "Then he is with us." Sigrun closed her eyes. She held her daughter's small hand against her cheek. For the first time in 18 months, she allowed herself to believe plainly, without any negotiation, that it might be true. The pastor came up the ridge on the Sunday following. His name was Obadiah Renfrew, and he had been the only ordained man in the Palouse country for 27 years and change. He was thin tall, the kind of thin that reads as ascetic on a young man and as merely worn on an old one. His coat was too big for him because it had once belonged to a heavier man he had ceased some years back to be. He rode without hurrying on an old mare who knew the trail up the ridge as well as she knew any trail in the county. And he stopped his horse at the base of the trail and dismounted, rather than ride up, because he had never yet in his ministry ridden a horse to a woman's door when he could walk to it instead. Sigrun met him at the top with a rag in her hand and lanolin in her hair. "Pastor, Mrs. Alvestad, would you take some coffee? I would be grateful for it." She invited him inside. The wagon was not finished. The walls were half packed. The stove was set, but had not yet been fully piped through the roof. There was a crate for a chair and a folded blanket to sit on, and Sigrun was still the kind of woman who did not let a visitor into her home without offering something warm from the fire, however small the fire, and however unfinished the home. Renfrew took the coffee. He drank it slow. He did not at first say anything. He did not quote scripture. He did not ask her about her soul. He looked once at the packed walls, and he looked once at the small black Bible on the crate beside the stove, where Sigrun had set it 2 nights before, and he looked back down into his cup. "Mrs. Alvestad, I have been a pastor in this valley for the better part of my adult life. In that time, I have watched a great many people wait for a miracle. Sometimes God sends one. Most of the time, in my honest experience, he does not." Sigrun held her own cup. She waited. "Most of the time, in my honest experience, he sends work instead. He sends hands that already know how to hold a hammer. He sends a memory of a grandmother in a Minnesota cabin. He sends a wagon left on a ridge by a husband who loved his wife enough to plan for his own dying." He looked up. His eyes were pale blue, tired and kinder than any eyes had any right to be at his age. "He sends the work, Mrs. Alvestad, and then he waits to see who will do it." Sigrun's throat closed. She could not answer him. She only nodded once. Renfrew set his empty cup on the crate. He stood. He put on his hat. He walked to the door and paused there, framed by the last of the September sun coming across the flats. "You are doing the work," he offered. Then he walked down the trail to his mare, and he mounted, and he rode away, and Sigrun stood in the doorway of the wagon and watched him go, and the sky behind him was the color of a lake at dusk in the country she had left as a bride 16 years earlier, and she held her coffee cup until it went cold in her hands. That night, after the children were asleep on the pallet in the corner, and the small stove had been banked, Sigrun sat by the yellow lantern with the Bible open on her lap. She read the flyleaf a 3rd time. "If I do not come home, do not wait." She had waited. She had waited 3 years. She had waited in that leaking cabin with the ice on the inside wall. She had waited through the winter that had taken Marit. She had waited most of all for some person, any person, to come up the trail and tell her what to do next, and no such person had ever come. And somewhere between 1 week and the next, without any decision she could name, she had stopped waiting. "Halvard," she offered quietly to the dark inside the wagon, "I am doing the work." The stove crackled. The children breathed. Outside, the first hard frost of the season was settling on the sagebrush. Barnaby Thorncastle rode up the ridge on the 21st day. Sigrun heard the hoofbeats and did not turn from the wagon. She had known someone would come eventually. She had thought it more likely to be one of the ranch hands than the man himself, and she was in a small internal way. She did not let show on her face. Surprise when the boots that hit the dirt below the wagon were the good expensive boots of a rancher who owned enough land not to have to walk over most of it. She set down her hammer. She wiped her hands on her apron. She turned. Barnaby Thorncastle stood at the edge of her small clearing with his hat in one hand and a folded paper in the other. He was 52 years old. He was broad through the shoulders in the way men are broad who have swung an axe as boys and never entirely lost the habit, even after they had been able to afford not to. He wore a dark coat clean, and his boots were clean, because Barnaby Thorncastle's boots were always clean, because clean boots were one of the small ways a man announced to the world that he had risen far enough above his beginnings not to have to touch what he owned with his own two hands anymore. He was not at that moment smiling. He was not sneering either. He looked at the wagon. He looked at the cellar hole Tori was digging beside it. He looked at the neat rows of drying racks under a scrap of canvas where Sigrun had begun putting up venison strips a neighbor had given her the previous week. He looked at last at Sigrun. "Mrs. Alvestad, Mr. Thorncastle, I did not know you were up here. I have been up here for 6 weeks. I did not know. That is not my problem, Mr. Thorncastle." His jaw moved. He was not accustomed to being addressed in that tone, and he was less accustomed still to being addressed in it by a widow with wool in her hair, and his jaw took a moment to arrive at a decision about how to receive it. He reached inside his coat. He drew out the folded paper. "Mrs. Alvestad, this ridge is my land." Silence. "I purchased it in 1879 from Mr. Ackerman before your husband ever set his boot in Umatilla County. The deed is on file in Pendleton. I have brought a copy." Sigrun did not blink. "This paper is a notice. You have 2 weeks to vacate the premises." The wind moved across the ridge. It caught a strand of Sigrun's hair. It laid it back down. She looked at him. She did not look at the paper. "Mr. Thorncastle, do you have a mother?" He blinked. "Beg pardon. A mother. Is she living?" "She is not. She died when I was 12. In the winter or in the summer?" Silence longer this time. "Winter." "Was the house cold, Mr. Thorncastle?" Barnaby Thorncastle stood there for a long moment. The paper was still held out. The 2 weeks were still unspoken. His hand did not move. His eyes moved. They moved slow without hurry across the packed wall of the wagon behind Sigrun. They moved across the doorway where Kirsten had appeared silent as always to stand and watch. They moved down to the cellar hole where Tori's small, dirty, waist-deep in cold Oregon earth stood with a river stone the size of his own head, cradled in both arms. The stone was too big for a 7-year-old. Tori was carrying it anyway. Something moved behind Barnaby Thorncastle's eyes, then some old thing, some memory of a January 1940 years back, in an Illinois farmhouse that had run out of firewood by the end of the first week, and he had not let himself touch that memory in a very long time. And the touching of it now was not a comfortable sensation for a man of his age and standing. He lowered the paper. He did not put it back in his coat. He did not hand it to her either. He held it folded at his side. 2 weeks, Mrs. Alvestad." He turned. He mounted his horse without looking back at her. He rode down the trail at the walk his horse preferred, slow, unhurried, and Sigrun stood in her small clearing and watched him go, and neither of them spoke another word. Kirsten came to stand at her mother's elbow. Kirsten looked down the trail after the rider. "Mother." "Who was that?" "That was the man who owns this hill. Is he going to make us leave?" Sigrun picked up her hammer. She looked past the retreating rider, past the flats below, past the far dark spine of the blue mountains to the horizon in the north, where a faint smudge of gray had begun in the last hour to spread. "He is going to try my love," she offered quiet. Somewhere far to the north above the mountains, the first storm of the season had begun to gather itself in a cloud that had not yet crossed the ridge. It would come. When it came, it would find her still on this hill. She lifted the hammer. She drove the next nail. The sound carried down into the valley. The sky over Meadowlark Ridge on the morning of the 23rd day carried the color of pewter, cooled too fast in water, a color that told Sigrun Alvestad exactly how many hours she had before the first real cold slipped down out of the blue mountains and settled into the bones of everything living. She had counted the days since Barnaby Thorncastle had ridden up her hill with that folded paper in his hand, and the counting had become a second heartbeat inside her chest, one that kept time whether she wanted it to or not. 2 weeks he had given her, and 8 of those days were already gone, and the wagon still had walls that whistled when she pressed her palm against them at night. She worked without sitting down. Kirsten brought a tin cup of chicory coffee at mid-morning and stood in the wagon doorway with her arms folded across her small chest, waiting the way she had learned to wait, and Sigrun took the cup because refusing it would have broken something in the girl that Sigrun could not afford to break. The coffee was bitter. The coffee was hot. The coffee was one more thing an 11-year-old had done without being asked, and Sigrun swallowed it and handed the cup back and went on driving nails into the frame around the small stovepipe where the wind had begun to find a seam. Tori carried water. That was his work now. Water and stones, and he did both without complaint. His small boots crunching the frost on the north slope of the ridge in the blue hour before the sun came over the eastern rim. He had turned some corner inside himself the night Sigrun had told him that his father had not left because he did not want them. He had folded that piece of knowledge into whatever quiet place 7-year-old boys keep the things that matter most, and he had come out of that folding with a straighter back and a slower way of setting each stone down into the cellar pit, as if the stones themselves were part of some agreement he had made with a man he barely remembered. The trouble came on a Tuesday, the way trouble often comes, riding into an ordinary afternoon on ordinary hooves. Kirsten walked up the hill from the little schoolhouse at the crossroads with her eyes on the ground and her lunch pail swinging light against her leg. Sigrun saw her from the wagon doorway and knew before the girl reached the clearing that something had been said because Kirsten had a way of carrying insult, the same way she carried grief folded small and pressed flat against her ribs where no one could see the shape of it. The girl climbed the 2 steps into the wagon. She set her books down. She untied her boots and lined them by the door the way her mother had taught her. Only then did she look up, and her eyes held a wet brightness that had nothing to do with the cold outside. Iris Ashcroft, she offered without preamble. Her voice held level by effort alone. She told the whole schoolyard, "You were a witch, Mother." She said, "You talk to wool like it hears you." She said, her mother told her papa left because he could not stand to look at us anymore. Sigrun set down her hammer. She sat on the wooden crate that served as her only chair, and she waited the way her own mother had once waited for her, giving the words room to breathe in the open air before either of them tried to answer them. Kirsten did not cry. Kirsten had stopped crying somewhere around the middle of the previous winter and had not started again, which was a worry Sigrun kept in a different pocket than the others, but did not forget. The girl waited, watching her mother the way small animals watch the sky. "What did you say back, my love?" The question came quiet without heat because Sigrun had learned long ago that a mother who asks in anger teaches her children to lie. Kirsten's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost something older than 11 had any right to be. She told her mother she had said that wool listened better than Iris Ashcroft ever had, and then she had picked up her pail and walked out of the yard while the other girls stared at her like she had grown a second head. Sigrun reached across the small space between them and pulled her daughter forward until Kirsten's forehead rested against her own, and she held her there for a long breath. "Your father," she offered against her daughter's hair, her voice thick with something she could not name. "Your father would have been proud of you today. He would have been proud enough to walk on air." Tori came home an hour later with his own version of the same trouble. Only Tori had not learned yet to fold things flat, and his version came out in a rush of words the moment his small boots hit the wagon floor. Tommy Callahan had said the thing at recess, had said it loud enough for the other boys to hear that Papa Alvestad had left because he had another woman down in Pendleton, that everyone knew it, that Tori's mother was pretending because pretending was easier than admitting she had been thrown away like a bad piece of meat. Tori had not swung at him. Tori had wanted to. Tori had stood there with both fists shaking at his sides and had not swung because his mother had told him once that fighting the loudest boy in the yard only made the boy louder. And Tori believed his mother the way 7-year-old boys believe the only person in the world who has never lied to them. Sigrun knelt in front of her son. She took both of those small trembling fists in her own hands, and she pressed them open one finger at a time until his palms lay flat against hers. "Look at me, Torvald." He looked. His eyes were his father's eyes, the color of the small lakes north of Duluth when the summer sky ran across them. "Your papa did not have another woman. Your papa had a sickness in his lungs that he did not want you to see. Your papa loved us so much that he walked away rather than let us watch him grow small. Do you understand the difference?" Tori did not answer with words. He nodded once slow, and then he pressed his face into his mother's collarbone and stayed there until his shoulders stopped shaking, and Sigrun held him and looked over the top of his head at Kirsten in the doorway, and Kirsten looked back, and in that shared glance, past something older than either of them, a knowledge that this was what a family looked like now. Three of them holding the wall up together against everything the valley had to throw. The knock came 4 nights later in the hour when the light was still bad enough that Sigrun almost did not answer, because knocks in the bad light rarely brought good news to a house without a man. But the knock was small, the knock was frightened. The knock was the sound a young woman makes when her hands are so cold she cannot quite close them into a proper fist. And Sigrun knew that sound, had heard it once from her own hand against a doctor's door in the middle of a March night, and she was on her feet and across the wagon before the second knock finished landing. Adeline Coburn stood on the step. She was 23 years old and looked younger than Kirsten. In that moment, her shawl slipping off one shoulder, her breath coming in the small white bursts that meant she had run the last half-mile of the trail. Wrapped tight against her chest, tucked inside the shawl, and against the warmth of her own skin, was a bundle so small, Sigrun could not at first tell whether it was moving. 2 months old. Little Junie Coburn, born in July when the wheat was still standing, born pink and loud, and already reaching for the world with both fists. The bundle was making a sound, now that was neither a cry nor a breath, but something wet and thin that lived in the space between the two. "Come in, Adeline. Come in this minute." Sigrun did not wait for the young mother to move on her own. She reached out and caught her by the elbow and drew her over the threshold, and she closed the door behind them with her hip, and the wagon settled back into its warm quiet, the way a lung settles after a held breath. Adeline stood in the middle of the small space and could not make her feet carry her any further. Her eyes moved across the wool-packed walls, across the felt strips around the doorframe, across the little iron stove, throwing its slow, steady heat into the room, and something in her face broke open, the way ice breaks on a river in the first true thaw, and she began to cry before she had even set the baby down. "My house," she offered, the words coming in pieces around the sobs she was trying to swallow. "My house has ice on the inside of the walls, Mrs. Alvestad. Samuel keeps the fire going all night, and by morning the water in the basin is froze solid, and Junie has been coughing since Sunday, and I did not know where else to go." Sigrun took the baby from her arms with the practiced quickness of a woman who had done this before, and she carried the small bundle to the pallet by the stove, and she began to unwrap the layers one at a time. Junie was hot. Junie was too hot. Junie's small chest was moving too fast under Sigrun's palm, and the wet rattle in her breath was the sound of a fluid Sigrun had heard before, the sound that had lived in her own daughter's chest one long March night that she did not let herself remember often, because remembering it too clearly made her hands shake in a way she could not afford. Kirsten was already at the shelf, pulling down the small tin of dried yarrow and the jar of honey and the clean muslin cloths Sigrun kept folded in a specific order, and Tori, without being asked, was drawing the kettle closer to the hot part of the stove. Neither child spoke. Neither child needed to. They had been schooled in this kind of night by the last one, the one they did not talk about, and their small hands moved with the terrible competence of children who had already lost too much. Sigrun laid the baby on her own lap. She loosened every stitch of clothing and let the wagon's warm air reach the small hot skin. She dipped a muslin cloth in the tepid water Kirsten brought her, wrung it out until it was only damp, and she began to sponge the baby's forehead, her neck, the small hot hollows behind her ears. Adeline sat on the crate opposite, her hands pressed flat against her mouth, and Sigrun spoke to her without looking up. "Tell me when the fever started. Tell me when the cough began. Tell me what you have given her and when." And Adeline told her in the small broken sentences of a mother who has been afraid alone for too many hours, and Sigrun listened and her hands did not stop moving. By midnight, the baby's breathing had eased by half a note. By the small hours, the wet rattle had loosened into something that could still be called dangerous, but could no longer be called drowning. Sigrun boiled water with yarrow in the kettle and let the steam rise around the baby's face, and she rubbed a smear of the honey mixed with a pinch of the dried herb along Junie's small hard gums, and she wrapped the baby in a fresh blanket, warmed against the stove, and she laid her against her own chest where the heat of a full-grown woman could hold the small body steady from the outside in. Kirsten made coffee. Tori, exhausted, curled against his sister on the pallet and slept the deep, flat sleep of a child who trusts his mother absolutely. And Adeline sat across from Sigrun in the yellow lantern light and watched her daughter's small ribs rise and fall in a rhythm that was beginning at last to look like the rhythm of a living thing. She did not speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was so small, Sigrun almost did not catch it, I was going to lose her, Mrs. Alvestad. I was going to lose her the way you lost yours. Sigrun's hand paused on the baby's back. She did not look up. She waited until she could speak without letting the wagon hear any of the sounds she had learned to keep behind her teeth. You did not lose her, Adeline. You picked her up and you carried her through the dark to a door you did not know would open. That is what a mother does. That is the only thing that matters. The gray light of morning found them still sitting there. The three of them, and the baby and Junie, woke and looked up at the ceiling of the wagon with the puzzled interest of an infant who has decided the world is worth another look. She made a small, hungry sound. Adeline began to laugh in the way people laugh when the only alternative is to shatter. Sigrun handed the baby back to her mother, and she watched Adeline put her daughter to the breast, and she turned to the stove and busied herself with the coffee so that no one would see her wipe her sleeve across her eyes. Samuel Coburn came up the hill that same afternoon. He was a large man, broad through the chest and shoulders, in the way blacksmiths are broad, with hands the size of dinner plates and a beard that had gone prematurely gray around his mouth. He walked up the trail with his hat in one fist and his eyes on the wagon like a man approaching a church he did not know the customs of. Sigrun met him in the clearing. He stood in front of her and could not for a moment find words. He looked at the wagon. He looked at his boots. He looked at the wagon again. Then he sank down onto one knee in the frozen grass, not the theatrical kneeling of a suitor, but the plain heavy kneel of a man whose knees had gone out from under him. Mrs. Alvestad, he offered, his voice cracking on the second syllable. I do not have the words for what you did last night. My wife told me. My daughter is breathing. I will bring you the best of everything I make in the forge for the rest of my life if you will let me. And I would take it as a great kindness if you would teach me what you know about walls. Sigrun reached down and caught him under the elbow, the same way she had lifted his wife over the threshold the night before, and she pulled him back to his feet because she could not bear to see a full-grown man on his knees for something that had been nothing more than one mother helping another. Come inside, Samuel Coburn. Come inside and drink coffee, and I will teach you every single thing I know. And when I am finished, you will teach the next man and the next. And by the time this valley sees a spring again, there will not be a house between the ridge and the river that a baby cannot sleep warm inside. He nodded. He could not manage more than that. He followed her into the wagon, and he sat on the crate that Adeline had sat on the night before, and Sigrun handed him coffee, and she began, patient and precise, to explain to him what wool did between two boards, and why the door had to be sealed with felt rather than tar, and how the small iron stove drank heat and gave it back through the long hours of the night if you knew how to bank it correctly. He listened. He asked questions. He wrote nothing down because Samuel Coburn had learned his letters late and did not trust his own hand. But Adeline came with him on the third day, and she brought a small cloth-bound notebook in the stub of a pencil, and she wrote everything down in her careful schoolteacher hand. And she went home that night and read her notes back to her husband by the light of their own kitchen lantern. And the two of them began the next morning at dawn to tear the west wall of their cabin apart and pack it board by board the way Sigrun had shown them. It took Samuel 4 days. On the fourth night, he came up the hill again and told Sigrun that his wife had slept in a nightdress for the first time since October, and Sigrun laughed, the sound catching her by surprise, and she realized as she laughed that she had not laughed aloud in company since before her husband disappeared. Word moves in a small valley the way water moves through cracked ground, finding every low place at once. By the end of that week, 2 more women had climbed the hill to Meadowlark Ridge, one of them a widow of only 6 months, whose husband had been thrown by a bad horse, the other a young farm wife who had lost a baby in September and had not yet been able to say the child's name aloud. Sigrun taught them both. She taught them standing in the wagon with her hands full of raw wool, and she taught them walking the perimeter of the cellar pit, and she taught them sitting on the crate with a cup of coffee cooling in their palms, and she taught them the small hard truth that they did not need permission from any man to keep their own children alive. The work went on, the stovepipe seated true, the felt along the north seam sealed, the cellar filled with braided trout and salted venison, and glass jars of the last of the wild carrots buried in dry sand. Sigrun rose each morning before the sky changed color and worked until the lantern would no longer hold back the dark, and she ate standing up, and she slept in short broken pieces on the pallet, with Tori's small back curled against her stomach and Kirsten's steady breathing at her shoulder, and she did not let herself think about what would happen if the 2 weeks ran out before the last board was in place. They did not run out, but not because time was kind. On the 12th day, in the late thin hour before supper, a rider came up the trail that Sigrun did not expect. It was not Barnaby. It was Millicent Thorncastle alone on a smaller horse than the one she usually rode wearing. Not her Sunday hat, but a plain wool bonnet the color of wet stone. She did not come up the last 100 yards. She stopped her horse at the foot of the hill and sat there in the saddle, her hands folded on the pommel, and she looked up at the wagon on the ridge for a long time without moving. Sigrun saw her from the doorway. Sigrun did not go down. Something in the set of the other woman's shoulders said that this was not a visit that could be helped along by hospitality, that whatever Millicent had come to do, she had to do without a hand offered to steady her. Kirsten came to stand beside her mother. She looked down the hill. "Who is that?" "That is Mrs. Thorncastle. What does she want?" "I do not know yet, my love. She has not decided herself." They watched her for perhaps a quarter of an hour, mother and daughter framed in the wagon door. And Millicent Thorncastle sat on her horse at the foot of Meadowlark Ridge and did not come up and did not go away. And finally, without any signal, Sigrun could see the woman turned her horse and rode slow back the way she had come. Her back very straight in the saddle, and a piece of something invisible went with her that Sigrun could feel but could not yet name. Kirsten looked up at her mother. She did not come up. She did not, my love. But she was here. That is not nothing. The needle broke on the 13th day. It was a small thing, a stupid thing, the kind of thing a woman notices only because her hands have been performing the same motion for so many hours that they have stopped belonging to her. Sigrun was sewing the last long seam of the door, felt for the third time, because the first two attempts had left a whisper of cold along the bottom edge that she could feel with her cheek but could not quite locate with her eye. The needle, an ordinary iron needle from Ordinary. Bickford stock snapped clean between her fingers, and one half of it stuck into the pad of her thumb before she quite understood what had happened. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the two broken pieces in her palm. She thought about how many needles she had used since September and how many more she would need before the door would seal the way it had to seal. And she thought about the two children asleep behind her, and she thought about her husband dead in a boarding house in Idaho Territory that she had never seen, and she thought about the small grave under the crooked cottonwood behind the rented cabin down in the valley. The grave with the wooden marker she had carved with her own knife, and the name she had not been able to say aloud in company for almost 18 months. And something inside her, some last hard thread that had been holding her upright since March, gave way all at once, without warning, without dignity, in the middle of the wagon floor, in the yellow light of a lantern that needed its wick trimmed. She did not make a sound at first. She sat with her face in her hands, and her shoulders shook, and the wood of the floor pressed cold up through her skirts, and she cried the way a person cries when they have finally reached the bottom of the well they have been climbing down into for a year and a half and have discovered that the bottom is not solid. Kirsten woke. Tori did not. Kirsten sat up on the pallet and saw her mother on the floor and did not thank every mercy cry out. The girl slid off the pallet in her nightdress and her bare feet, and she crossed the small space of the wagon without hurrying, and she knelt down on the boards beside her mother, and she put her small warm palm flat between her mother's shoulder blades, and she left it there, and she did not speak for a long time. When she did speak, her voice was so quiet the lantern almost swallowed it. "Mother, grandmother would be proud of you." Sigrun lifted her face out of her hands. She looked at her daughter. Kirsten's eyes were dry. Kirsten's mouth was set in the exact expression Sigrun's own mother had worn the day they buried her father. A mouth that had learned early not to tremble, because trembling was a luxury for people whose children were not watching. Sigrun pulled her daughter into her lap, the way she had not been able to do since Kirsten had begun to think of herself as too old for laps, and Kirsten did not resist, and the two of them sat on the floor of the wagon in the yellow light for a long time, without any further conversation being necessary. "Kirsten," she offered finally, the words coming out rough, honest. The kind of thing a mother only says when a needle has broken and the bottom of the well has fallen out. "You are the best thing I have ever done in my life. Do you hear me? The very best." Kirsten pressed her face against her mother's collarbone. She did not answer with words. She did not need to. Some knowledge passes between women without requiring the interference of language, and Sigrun felt her daughter accept the thing that had been said, and she held her. And outside the wagon the wind picked up along the north face of the ridge and moved on toward the valley without finding a way in. The knock came 4 nights after that. It was not the small, frightened knock of Adeline Coburn. It was not the polite hesitation of Millicent's earlier ride. It was a fist-heavy, frantic, the kind of knock that comes from a person who has run out of dignity somewhere on the trail up the hill and has only fear left in the fist by the time it reaches the door. Sigrun was already awake. She had been mending the elbow of Tori's smallest shirt by the stove because she could not sleep, and she was on her feet before the second blow landed. Millicent Thorncastle stood on the step. Not the woman from the horse at the foot of the hill. Not the woman from the general store with the Sunday hat cocked at exactly the angle her husband's money required. Her hair was down around her shoulders in wild ropes. Her coat was buttoned wrong, one hole off all the way up so that the collar sat crooked against her throat. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts, and her cheeks were the color of wet paper, and her eyes had gone somewhere very far away and were only barely holding on to the doorway in front of her. Cradled in her arms so tight against her chest that Sigrun could not at first see the small face at all, was her son, Percival Thorncastle, 7 years old, the same age as Tori the boy, who looked like Barnaby around the mouth and like Millicent around the eyes, and who had once run past Sigrun on the road with a small, polite tip of his cap, because his mother, whatever else she was, had raised her children with manners. He was not moving right. His head lolled against his mother's shoulder. His face was flushed a deep, unnatural rose. His breath was pulling in and out in a shallow, rapid pattern that Sigrun recognized before her mind gave permission to recognize it. The pattern of a small body burning too hot for too long. The pattern that meant hours, not days, if help did not come, and come now. Millicent's eyes finally found Sigrun's face. Whatever pride the woman had ever carried was gone from those eyes. Whatever cruelty she had ever spoken from a saddle on a September morning was gone. What remained was the only thing that ever remained in a mother's eyes at that hour in that light, with that weight in her arms. "Mrs. Alvestad, please." "My boy, the doctor cannot get through. The low crossing is underwater. The messenger came back an hour ago. Please, please. I know what I have said. I know what I have done. I do not ask for myself. Please." The wind pushed cold through the open door. Kirsten was already sitting up on the pallet, her eyes huge and steady in the lantern light. Tori stirred and did not wake. Sigrun stood in the doorway for the length of one long breath. She looked at Millicent Thorncastle. She looked at the small, hot face against the woman's collar. She thought about a March night 18 months gone, about a fever that had come at dusk, and a cough that had come at midnight, and a small chest that had gone still under her hand before dawn. She thought about a promise made in a muddy field to a name the wind had taken. She thought about a door with two purposes. She stepped back. She opened the door the whole way. "Bring him inside, Millicent. Bring him to the stove." The door closed behind them. The latch settled with its quiet thump. The wind stayed on the outside of the wood where it belonged, and inside the wagon on Meadowlark Ridge. The small iron stove threw its slow, patient heat into a room that had been built board by board and handful by handful for exactly this hour. Percy weighed almost nothing in Sigrun's arms. That was the first thing she noticed as she took the boy from his mother and carried him the 3 short steps to the pallet by the stove. A child that age should have felt like a full sack of grain against her ribs. This one felt like a bundle of kindling wrapped in a nightshirt, and the heat coming off his small forehead was the kind of heat that burned through cloth without any effort at all. She laid him down. She loosened the collar of his shirt. She placed the flat of her palm against his chest, between the 2 small ridges of his collarbones, and she felt the rapid, shallow flutter of a heart working harder than any 7-year-old heart had any business working. Millicent stood in the middle of the wagon with her arms still curved around the empty shape where her son had been. She did not know what to do with the sudden lightness. She looked at her hands as if they belonged to someone else, and then she looked at Sigrun, and then she looked at the small, flushed face on the pallet, and her knees went out from under her, the way Samuel Coburn's had gone out from under him in the frozen grass. She did not fall. Kirsten was there, quiet as always, sliding the wooden crate under Millicent's descending weight so that the woman sat rather than collapsed, and Millicent did not seem to notice the girl at all, only that the floor had been kind enough to meet her partway. "Kirsten, wake your brother. Send him to fetch a bucket of the fresh well water, not the cistern. Then come back." The girl moved. Tori sat up, rubbing his eyes, took one look at the boy on the pallet and the woman on the crate, and asked no questions. He pulled his boots on over his sleeping stockings and went out into the black cold with the bucket in his fist, and the door closed behind him with a competent click, and Sigrun turned back to the child and began the long work of the night. She had done this before. That was the terrible knowledge under everything. The weight that sat on her sternum as her hands moved through the practiced motions. She had sponged a small hot forehead in exactly this pattern, once already in a leaking cabin down in the valley, in the black hour before a March dawn, and the sponging had not been enough that time. She did not let the memory into the room. She kept it pressed flat against the inside of her ribs, where it could not slow her hands. Her fingers found the muslin cloths. Her voice when she used it came out level and quiet, the voice of a woman giving instructions to a kitchen full of helpers, rather than a woman holding a life on the flat of her palm. Millicent, take off his stockings. Fold his shirt open to the waist. Do not cover him with the blanket. Do not, no matter how much he shivers. The shivering is not what it looks like. The shivering is his small body trying to burn the fever off, and if you wrap him tight, you will trap the heat where it can do him harm. Do you hear me? Millicent heard her. Millicent's hands, which had ordered servants and directed teamsters, and never once done the plain work of stripping. A fevered child obeyed with a fumbling gentleness that would have moved Sigrun to something like pity if there had been room in her chest for pity at that hour. Tori came back with the water. Kirsten took it from him at the door, poured a measure into the smaller kettle, already warming on the back of the stove, then took the rest to the far end of the wagon where the air was coolest, and dipped the muslin cloths into it one at a time. She wrung them out to just damp, not wet, the way she had learned by watching, and she carried them back to her mother in a small, careful stack. The first one Sigrun folded across Percy's forehead. The second she draped over the back of his neck. The third she pressed against the hollows behind his knees, where the great veins ran close to the surface, and the blood could be cooled without shocking the heart. She talked to the boy as she worked, not to Millicent. To Percy in the low, steady voice a person uses on a startled horse, telling him what her hands were doing, telling him that the cold cloth was a friend, telling him that his mother was right there on the crate, and that he was safe inside 4 warm walls, and that all he had to do was breathe. He did not answer. His eyes were closed. The lids fluttered now and then in a way that Sigrun did not care for, but the shallow, rapid breathing began by very small degrees to lengthen. Not by much. Not by enough. Enough to keep going. The first night bled into the first morning without any observable break. Sigrun did not sit down. She changed the cloths every quarter hour, guided by some inner clock she did not have to consult. She spooned water past the boy's lips 1 drop at a time, letting the swallow reflex do the work, coaxing a small sip of honey water into him whenever his eyes opened enough to focus. She sent Kirsten to feed the stove with the small, quick sticks that made a hot, even flame without smoke. She sent Tori to lie back down on the far end of the pallet because a 7-year-old with red-rimmed eyes was no help to anyone, and Tori, understanding, went. Millicent sat on the crate through all of it. She did not weep, she did not speak. She watched her son's chest rise and fall, and every so often she would reach out and touch the arch of his small foot where it stuck out from under Sigrun's hands, as if to reassure herself that the foot was still warm, still there, still hers. Once near the gray edge of morning, she looked up and her eyes met Sigrun's across the pallet. She began to shape a word with her mouth. Sigrun shook her head 1 small firm motion. Not now, Millicent. Save all of it. He is going to need every ounce you have left, and so am I. Millicent closed her mouth. She nodded. She looked back down at her son. The second day the fever climbed. That was the hour Sigrun had been most afraid of, the hour when the small, hot body reaches for the last high plateau before it either breaks the fever or is broken by it, and Percy's cheeks went a color that Sigrun had seen once before in her life and did not wish ever to see again. She moved him off the pallet and onto a folded quilt on the floor closer to the door where the ambient air was colder. She stripped him down to the linen drawers his mother had put on him at bedtime. She wrung a fresh cloth in water that Kirsten had cooled with a chip of ice from the last of the icehouse harvest, and she laid it across the boy's chest, and Percy gasped once at the sudden cold, a sharp, small gasp that was the first real sound he had made since arriving, and Millicent made a noise in her throat that was not a word. He is fighting, Millicent. That gasp was fight. Do you hear me? He has not gone anywhere. Millicent nodded. She did not trust her voice. Sigrun did not require her to trust it. The second night was worse. The boy grew restless around midnight, thrashing in the shallow way that fever-thick children thrash, muttering words, that were not quite words, calling out once for his father in a voice that was too small for the size of the wagon. Millicent bent over him. She caught the small hand and pressed it to her cheek, and answered him without any care for who was listening. "Papa is coming, my darling. Papa is riding through the night to see you. All you have to do is wait for him." The lie was clean and steady. The lie was the only medicine any mother had left in that hour. Sigrun did not correct her. Barnaby Thorncastle was in fact at that same moment down at the low crossing with 3 ranch hands and a lantern, trying to find a passable route around the swollen creek. But that piece of information would not have helped anyone in the wagon. So Sigrun let the lie stand. Somewhere in the dead middle hour, Kirsten made coffee for everyone who could drink it. Tori, without being asked, brought his own blanket from the pallet and laid it across Millicent's shoulders because the woman had begun to shiver in the way that grief and exhaustion cause the body to shiver even in a warm room. Millicent looked down at the blanket. She looked at the small boy who had brought it to her. She began for the first time to weep, a slow, silent weeping that did not interrupt her vigil over her son, but ran down her face without her seeming to notice. Tori did not know what to do with a crying rich lady on his mother's crate. He did what his father would have done. He patted her on the back of the hand, one small, solemn pat, and then he retreated to the pallet and lay down again, because that was what the moment had required of him, and he had done it. The 3rd day the fever broke. It did not break dramatically. There was no shattering, no sudden rush of sweat, none of the moments the old wives told each other about in kitchens across the valley. It broke the way stubborn things usually break, in small degrees, a quarter of a degree at a time, so that Sigrun did not quite believe it for the first hour, and then not quite believe it for the second, and only after the 3rd did she allow herself to lift her palm from the boy's forehead and turn to Millicent and offer in the plainest voice she owned, "Millicent, I is going to be all right." Millicent's face did not move for a full 3 seconds. Then it moved all at once in the way a dam moves when the wall finally goes, and she made a sound Sigrun would remember for the rest of her life, a sound that came out of the deepest chamber of the woman's chest, and had nothing polite about it and nothing rehearsed. She slid off the crate. She landed on her knees on the wagon floor beside her son. She pressed her forehead against the small, warm hand, and she did not speak for a very long time. Sigrun stood up. Her legs did not entirely remember how to be legs. She walked to the door of the wagon. She opened it. She stepped out into the thin, bright cold of a morning that had been going on without her for 3 days, and she stood on the top step and looked out over the valley, and she let the wind take whatever it wanted from her face for the space of one long breath. Percy asked for bread around noon. That was how they knew for certain. His voice was thin still. His eyes were only half open. But the word came clear, a small, definite request from a small, definite person who had decided the world was worth another try. Kirsten cut the bread. Sigrun warmed it against the stove and spread it with a thin skim of butter from the crock. Millicent held her son's head up so he could swallow, and Percy ate the whole slice in small, careful bites, and then he asked for another, and then he closed his eyes and fell into a real sleep, the deep, flat sleep of a child whose body has decided to live. Millicent sat back on her heels beside the pallet. She looked up at Sigrun. She began to lower herself further, the movement unmistakable, the intention plain. She was going to press her forehead to the floor at Sigrun's feet, was going to kneel to the widow she had mocked from a saddle 2 months before, and Sigrun saw the descent begin and move fast. She caught the woman under both elbows before her forehead could reach the boards. She lifted. She lifted the whole weight of Millicent Thorncastle back up to standing, and she held her there, one steady hand on each of Millicent's arms. "Do not kneel to me. Do not ever kneel to me." Millicent's face crumpled the way expensive cloth crumples in a wet fist. "But you saved him. You saved him after all the things I said. I sat on that horse and I laughed at you. I called you honey in the store like you were a child. My daughter told my son that your husband left because you drove him off. I said that in my own kitchen. I let my son carry that into a schoolyard. I do not deserve. I cannot. Please let me. Please." Sigrun did not let her. Sigrun held her upright and looked into her face and offered her the only sentence that had ever been true between them. "We are both mothers, Millicent. That is the whole of it. That has always been the whole of it. Sit down, drink something warm. Your boy needs you when he wakes, and he will not want to see you on the floor." Millicent sat. She could not do anything else. She sat and she watched her son sleep, And after a while, Kirsten came and put a cup of coffee into her hands and she drank it. And by the time the cup was empty, her hands had stopped shaking. Percy went home on the sixth day. He walked out on his own 2 feet, holding his mother's hand, still pale, still slower than a 7-year-old ought to be, but upright, and asking questions about a colt his father had promised him for his next birthday. Barnaby had come up the hill 3 separate times during those days, standing at the foot of the trail exactly the way his wife had once stood, unable to make the last 100 yards, sending word each time, by way of a ranch hand, that he would take his son home whenever the widow said the boy was ready. On the 6th morning, Sigrun said it. Barnaby came up the trail with a spare horse. He took his son onto his own saddle, the boy folded small against his chest under the wool of the great coat, and he looked at Sigrun without any words for a long moment. He removed his hat. He held it in his fist against his thigh. He offered finally the only sentence he had been able to assemble on the ride up Mrs. Alvestad. There is not going to be a paper anywhere between here and Pendleton that will make right what I owe you. But I mean to start trying. Whatever you need on this hill, whatever you need for the rest of your life, it is done. You have only to say. Sigrun nodded. She did not answer with words. Some debts are the kind you accept in silence because speaking of them would cheapen the currency. And she let Barnaby ride down the hill with his son in his arms, and she watched him until horse and rider and boy were the size of a fist against the pale fields. And then she went back inside and she sat down on the crate and she put her face in her hands for exactly the count of 10 before she stood back up and went to check the door felt. Millicent came up the hill herself the next afternoon. She brought a saddlebag of good clean wool, the finest carding of the Thorncastle clip, which she had sat and picked over by hand at her own kitchen table for the whole of the previous evening. She brought a jar of honey that had come up the wagon road all the way from a beekeeper outside Baker City. She brought no money, having understood at last that money was the one gift Sigrun would have found insulting. She climbed the trail on foot leading her horse because she said she wanted to know what a person felt in her legs coming up that hill. And when she reached the wagon, she was breathing hard, and her cheeks were red with the effort, and Sigrun met her at the door and drew her inside and made coffee. They sat across the small space, the two of them, and Millicent looked around the wagon in the daylight for the first time. She had not seen it really during the vigil. She had seen only the pallet and the stove and the small shape of her son. Now she saw the packed walls, the felted door, the shelf with its jars and its small black Bible. The neat corner where the children slept, the whole small kingdom Sigrun had assembled out of nothing but nail and wool and refusal. She did not exclaim. She had learned enough by now not to exclaim. She only nodded once, slow taking the measure of the place. Then she offered in a voice that had lost the bell-clear certainty it used to carry. I have said things about you, Sigrun, that I have no right to unsay. I know that. What I can do is stop saying them. What I can do is walk through this valley for the rest of my life, saying the opposite thing in every parlor I am asked into, until the last woman in the last farmhouse between here and the river knows what you did on this hill. That is what I intend to do. I do not ask your permission. I only wanted you to hear the shape of it from my own mouth. Sigrun took a long swallow of her coffee. She looked at Millicent over the rim of the cup. That would be a kindness, she offered quiet. Millicent left an hour later. Word began moving through the valley the following morning, and it moved faster than word had ever moved on the mere matter of a fever-broken boy, because it moved on the back of the loudest woman in 3 counties. And Millicent Thorncastle, once she had decided to sing a song, sang it in every register she owned. Adeline Coburn came up twice more that week, bringing Junie in a sling against her chest, the baby now fat and pink and grabbing at the wool bundles with 2 determined fists. She brought other women with her. She brought Hetty Ashcroft's own younger sister, a woman named Perpetua, who lived with her husband on a small hardscrabble claim north of the ridge, and Perpetua sat on the crate and cried without shame for 20 minutes, because her own baby had been born in September, and she had been afraid all through October of a winter she could not name. Sigrun taught her. Sigrun taught her the whole method start to finish, and Perpetua went home and taught her husband, and by the middle of the following week, there were 3 more cabins in the northern reach of the valley with wool between their walls. Winifred Price came up the hill on a Sunday. She came alone. She was the youngest of the 3 women who had ridden past on that September morning, and she had not laughed as loud as Hetty, but she had laughed, and she carried the memory of her own laughter now like a stone in her shoe. She did not come with wool or honey. She came with a small enameled tin containing 3 of her best tallow candles, The long, slow-burning kind she made herself in her own kitchen with a wick doubled for extra light, and she stood in the doorway of the wagon and offered them to Sigrun, with both hands out flat, the way a child offers a thing she is not sure will be accepted. "I was on that horse," she offered, her chin already trembling. "I was on that horse, Mrs. Alvestad, and I did not have the courage to say a word to Hetty or to Mrs. Thorncastle, and I have been carrying it. I do not expect these candles to be enough. I only wanted to bring something that would burn in your window on the dark nights, because you have been the light on this hill for the whole valley, and it seemed only right that the light should be repaid in kind." Sigrun took the tin. She set it carefully on the shelf beside the Bible. She looked at Winifred for a long moment, and then she offered her hand plain and open palm up. Winifred took it. They did not speak further. Winifred left. The candles stayed on the shelf, and Sigrun burned one that same evening, and the light through the small window of the wagon carried further down the valley than she would ever quite know. The bones inside Sigrun's left knee began to ache on the 7th evening after Percy went home. It was a specific ache, an old ache one her grandmother in the Bemidji cabin had taught her to trust more than any almanac ever printed. The old woman had said it plain sitting by her own stove 60 winters after learning it from her own mother. "The knee knows before the sky knows, little one. When the north corner of you starts to speak, you close every door in the house and you fill every kettle to the top. The sky has not decided yet, but the knee has." Sigrun rubbed the joint through the wool of her skirt. She stood in the doorway of the wagon in the last blue of the day, and she looked north across the Palouse toward the dark spine of the Blue Mountains, and she saw the horizon. It was not a bank of cloud, it was a wall. Gray along the bottom, black along the top, moving with the slow, unhurried certainty of a thing that had decided its business and did not require anyone's permission to conduct it. She had seen weather in her life. She had grown up in weather. This was the other kind, the kind old men in feed stores would talk about in 40 years, the kind that becomes a landmark on the calendar, so that people afterwards say the winter before or the winter after, and everyone knows which one is meant. She turned back into the wagon. Kirsten was already looking at her, having read her mother's face the moment the door had opened, and Kirsten set aside the shirt she had been mending without needing to be told. Tori more slowly understood. Sigrun crossed to the small window and pulled the second latch closed on the shutter, the one she had only just installed last week. She checked the seal along the base of the door with the palm of her hand. She checked the felt around the stovepipe. She checked the small square of iron she had bolted over the pipe collar, because Halvard in some Idaho boarding house had told a stranger that the collar was always the weakest place on any pipe, in any stove, in any winter. Kirsten, bring in every stick of wood, all of it, not just the top of the pile. Torvald, the water buckets, all 4 filled to the brim. Then you fill the copper kettle. Then you fill the 2 milk cans. Then you come inside. Do you understand me? He understood. He was gone through the door before she had finished the last word. Kirsten was already at the woodpile. Sigrun herself went to the cellar hatch, opened it, went down the 6 worn steps she had cut into the earth, and she checked the mason jars, the salted venison, the braided trout, the wax-topped crocks of butter, the last of the wild carrots in their box of dry sand. She counted twice. She came back up. She latched the hatch. She wedged the small square of wool felt she had cut for exactly this purpose along the seam of the hatch cover. She stood up. Enough for 6 months if we are careful. Enough for 8 if we are ruthless. She knew going to be ruthless. The first flakes began sometime after full dark. They did not come down in the friendly wet drift of an ordinary snowfall. They came sideways, small and hard as fine gravel driven along a wind that had teeth in it from the first minute. Sigrun heard the change in the sound of the wagon walls before she heard the change in the wind itself. There was a particular high whisper that had used to run along the north seam in a light breeze, and that whisper stopped because a light breeze had ceased to exist somewhere out over the fields and been replaced by something that no longer bothered whispering. Tori finished the last of the water inside of 30 minutes. He came in with his hair full of the small gravel flakes and his cheeks bright red and his mouth set in the serious line of a small boy who had understood without being told that the next several days were going to require him to be older than he was. Sigrun took the buckets from him. She poured half the first bucket into the reservoir on the back of the stove, where it would warm slowly through the night and give them tempered water for washing and drinking. The rest she set along the inner wall of the wagon, where they could not freeze but would stay cool enough to keep. Kirsten stacked the wood in two neat pyramids by the stove, small pieces near larger ones behind all of it, inside the wagon so that no one would have to open the door for fuel until the storm made up its mind to leave. They ate a hot supper. Sigrun insisted. She made a thick porridge with the last of the fresh milk and a spoonful of the honey from Millicent's jar, and she made Tori eat 2 full bowls and Kirsten 1.5, and she herself ate standing up because her feet had not agreed to sit down since the fever had broken, and she was not going to argue with them now. She banked the stove for the first long burn. She lowered the wick on the lantern to save the coal oil. She sat down at last on the pallet with her back against the packed wall, and she pulled both children in against her one, under each arm, and she felt Tori's warm weight go slack against her ribs within a matter of minutes, and Kirsten's warm weight follow shortly after, and Sigrun herself did not sleep because someone had to listen to the wall. The wall held. She had known it would. She had built it too. But there was a difference between knowing and hearing, and she sat there in the yellow half-light, and she listened to the wind push against every inch of the wagon and find not one seam. It could pry loose in something inside her chest, some knot that had been drawn tight since Barnaby's paper had come out of his coat pocket, began at last to loosen by very small degrees. The knot came somewhere in the deep middle of the second night of the storm. It was not the frantic fist of Millicent. It was not the small frozen hand of Adeline. This knock was slow. This knock was weak. This knock was the knock of a person who had walked much too far in exactly the wrong direction, whose gloves had frozen shut around whatever they had last held, whose fingers no longer bent enough to make a proper strike against wood. It was a scraping more than a knock. A scraping and then a pause and then a scraping again at the level a man's shoulder would reach if the man were leaning against the door because his legs would no longer hold him at full height. Sigrun was on her feet before Kirsten stirred. She crossed the wagon in 3 strides. She lifted the latch. She caught the man across the threshold with both arms as he came forward because he had been leaning against the door with the whole of his remaining weight, and when the door gave, he came with it. She staggered under him. He was taller than Halvard had been, and long through the arms and the legs, and he was frozen so thoroughly that she could hear the crackle of ice in his beard as she guided him past the doorframe and closed the door behind him with her hip and lowered him, more or less controlled, to the floor beside the stove. Kirsten was up. Kirsten was already moving. She pulled the second blanket from the pallet, the good one, the wool one Sigrun had traded 3 days of hemming work to a woman in the valley for. She wrapped it around the stranger's shoulders even before Sigrun had finished setting him down. The man's eyes were open. That was the first mercy. They were not tracking well, but they were open, and when Sigrun said her name to him plain and clear, he blinked once and then again in a way that suggested the words had reached him. She did not ask him questions. She would ask questions later. She worked the frozen scarf off his face by cutting through it with the paring knife, rather than trying to unwrap it, because the wool had frozen to his beard, and pulling would have taken skin. She got his gloves off the same way. His hands underneath were the color of raw dough with dark spots at the tips of 3 fingers on the right, and Sigrun's mouth tightened at the sight of the dark spots because dark spots meant frostbite that had gone past the first stage, and she was not sure yet whether the fingers were savable. She would find out. First, warmth. First, the man had to be a man again before she could sort out which pieces of him she might have to argue for. She sat him with his back against the packed wall, where the wool would give warmth from behind, while the stove gave warmth from the front. She took a shallow pan of water that Kirsten had already begun to warm, and she brought it not to hot but to lukewarm, and she immersed his ruined hands in it up to the wrists. He gasped once, not from pain, from the mere shock of feeling something that was not the killing cold, and his eyes came the rest of the way into focus, and he looked at her, and his mouth moved, and he offered in a voice that had been rubbed raw by hours of wind against a scarf, "Ma'am, I do not know how I found this door. I was walking east. I am fairly sure I was walking east. There was a light. I do not know whose light. The light on this hill is my light. You found it because I put it in the window on purpose. Do not talk any more until you have taken broth." Kirsten. The soup. Kirsten was already ladling. She brought the tin cup to the man, and Sigrun helped him hold it because his hands were still in the water and useless to him. He drank in small sips the way a person drinks after coming back from very far away, and after the 3rd sip, he closed his eyes and let his head rest back against the wool. And Sigrun watched a little more of the man come back into the body. One small color at a time, the way a photograph develops in a chemist's tray. Hein gave his name after the second cup of broth. Rufus Kettleman, 38 years old, a freight driver working the run between Pendleton and the small mining settlements up along the Grande Ronde River, married 2 daughters based out of a rented room in Pendleton because he was on the road 9 months of the year and his wife had family in the town who kept the girls company while he was gone. His wagon had lost an axle a mile down the ridge near the ford across the little creek that fed the north pasture. He had cut the horse loose so the animal would have a chance to work its way towards shelter. He had made the choice to walk rather than shelter with the wagon because the wagon had been carrying a load of cured hides, and the cured hides had already been more than warm enough on their own to attract wolves, and Rufus Kettleman was not. He offered plainly the sort of man who cared to lie down for the night in a bed of hides that a wolf might come sniffing for. He talked. Sigrun let him. She had learned by now that the fastest way to bring a man back from the edge of dying was to let him tell the story of why he had almost died, because the telling put the whole thing outside of him where he could look at it, and once he could look at it, he could stop being it. She refilled his cup. She changed the water in his pan when it cooled. She watched with a small, tight satisfaction as the color came back into 2 of the 3 dark fingertips on his right hand. The third one she was less sure of, but 2 out of 3 was a good night's work by any accounting. He talked himself into sleep somewhere before dawn. She left him propped where he sat, the blanket wrapped tight, his hands wrapped now in dry muslin, over a smear of the tallow she used for the children's chapped skin, his boots off and drying on the far side of the stove. She sat down at last on the crate opposite him. She looked at him in the yellow light, a stranger in her wagon. The first grown man who had slept under her roof since Halvard had walked out into the March storm 3 winters earlier. She did not know yet what his arrival meant. She only knew that the door had done its work, it had stayed closed against the storm, and it had opened for the man, and both purposes had been served on the same long night without any contradiction. Kirsten sat down beside her. The girl did not speak. She only leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, and the 2 of them watched the stranger sleep. And outside the wagon, the wind pushed against a wall that had been built by patience, and the wall did not move. Rufus Kettleman slept the whole of the second day of the storm. That was the thing his body needed, and Sigrun let his body have it. She checked his fingers every hour. The 2 on the right that had begun to pink up continued to pink up. The third one, the middle finger, stayed a color she did not care for, a mottled purple that darkened toward the tip. And by the middle of the afternoon, she made the private decision that the man was going to lose the last joint of it, and she began to prepare herself for the conversation she would have with him when he woke enough to hear it. A middle finger's last joint was in the accounting of what the storm could have taken a bargain. He woke at dusk. He sat up slow. He looked at the wagon around him with the confused, careful attention of a man trying to remember whether he had dreamed the previous night. Then his eyes fell on the small black Bible on the shelf above the stove, and everything in his face went still, and he did not speak for a long moment. And when he did speak, his voice had gone somewhere flat that Sigrun did not immediately understand. "Ma'am, may I ask where that book came from?" Sigrun looked at the shelf. She looked at Rufus. Something small and cold moved down the inside of her spine. "That book belonged to my husband." Rufus closed his eyes. He kept them closed for the count of 5. When he opened them, there was water in the corners that had nothing to do with the fire. "Oh no," he offered, quiet more to himself than to her. "Oh ma'am, oh no. Mr. Kettleman, you knew my husband." Rufus could not answer at first. He reached with his damaged hand toward the shelf as if to touch the Bible from where he sat. And then he stopped because he understood he had no right to touch it without being invited. And he lowered his hand back to his lap, and he looked at Sigrun, and he offered her the sentence that was going to change the shape of her whole grief. "Halvard Alvestad," he offered. "I sat by his bed for 3 months in a boarding house in Idaho City in the fall and winter of 1883. He died on a Thursday in the second week of December. I was in the next room when he went. He was not alone." Sigrun sat down on the crate. Her legs did not consult her about it. Kirsten came silent to stand beside her mother and Tori, who had been at the far end of the wagon reading his sister's school book. By the lantern, understood without being told that this was a conversation to be listened to and not interrupted, and he set the book down and did not move. "Tell me," she offered. "Do not soften it. I have been 3 years without knowing. I would rather have the whole shape of it now than a smaller shape kindly given." "Tell me," Rufus told her. He told her he had come out of Pendleton in the spring of 1883, with a load of dry goods for the mining camps up along the middle fork of the Boise River, and he had stopped for a night at a hard-luck placer settlement called Idaho City that had a boarding house run by an old widow named Mrs. Jorstad, and in the boarding house he had met a Norwegian carpenter with a cough who had been paying his room by teaching the miners how to pack their cabin walls with wool. The carpenter had introduced himself as Sigrun Alvestad. He had been thin already by then. His cough had been the kind Rufus had heard before in mining camps, the kind that meant the man was measuring his remaining months in single digits. He had not asked Rufus's business. He had asked instead whether Rufus ever ran the freight route through Umatilla County in Oregon, and when Rufus had answered that he did, sometimes the carpenter had gone quiet for a long moment and had then asked Rufus to sit with him a while. They had sat Halvard and Rufus on the porch of the boarding house that first evening, and Halvard had told Rufus about a wife in the Palouse country. He had not given the wife's name. He had given only the fact of her and the fact of 2 children, and the fact of a 3rd child he did not yet know was already gone. He had told Rufus that he had walked out of Oregon in February of 1881 because a doctor in Pendleton had told him he had consumption in both lungs and would not see another spring, and he had not wanted his wife to nurse him through the dying because his wife had already nursed her own mother through a dying 20 years before, and he had watched what that dying had done to the daughter, and he was not, he had said plainly, going to do that to Sigrun. He had walked east through the storm. He had not intended to die in the storm. He had intended to walk far enough that he could stop being anyone's husband and then find a bed somewhere in another country and finish the dying quietly. The storm had nearly killed him faster than the consumption. He had been picked up on the 3rd day by a party of freighters coming up from Baker City who had put him in the back of a wagon and hauled him as far as a way station in the mountains where he had recovered enough to walk again and had continued east on his own 2 feet all the way into Idaho territory. He had reached Idaho City in the late spring of 1881, and he had taken a room at Mrs. Jorstad's boarding house, and he had lived there for 2 years and 7 months. And in those 2 years and 7 months, he had done exactly one thing that mattered. He had taught 15 families of miners how to pack their cabin walls with raw wool, how to seal their doors with felt, how to bank a small iron stove for the long, slow burn, how to keep small children warm through winters at 7,000 feet, where the ordinary methods of the country simply were not enough. He had done it, Rufus offered quiet in the memory of a wife he was not going to see again. I had done it, he had told Rufus once on a summer evening on the porch, because there was a woman somewhere in the Palouse country who had lost a mother young and a daughter young and who would, when her own time came, know things her neighbors did not know, and he wanted to make sure that by the time she stood up in her own grief and started to teach what she knew, there would already be women teaching it in other valleys, in other territories, so that the knowledge would not stop with her, so that whatever she built would not be the only building of its kind on the map. He had wanted her not to be alone in it. That was what he had said. Sigrun's hand had come up somewhere in the middle of the telling. It sat now over her mouth. She did not lower it. She did not weep. The tears ran anyway, slow and steady past her fingers and down the back of her wrist, and she did not lift the hand to catch them. Kirsten leaned in against her mother's side and did not speak, and Tori at the far end of the wagon sat very small and very still, and Rufus went on. "Hi gave me a letter, ma'am, in the last week of his life. He wrote it out slow over 3 evenings in that same slow, careful English he used for everything he wrote, and he sealed it, and he put it into my hand, and he made me promise. He made me promise that if I was ever in the course of my run in Umatilla County, I would ask after a Norwegian widow named Alvestad, and I would put that letter into her hand, and I would tell her one thing from him." Sigrun waited. Rufus's voice when it came was steadier than the words themselves had any right to make it. He said, "Tell her I am not sorry. Tell her I did what needed doing. Tell her the wagon on the ridge will hold whatever she builds onto it, and tell her I have been building the same thing here in a different valley so that when she stands up, she will not be standing up alone." Sigrun took her hand away from her mouth. She looked at Rufus. She waited for the rest. "I lost the letter, ma'am. I do not know how. I had it in the inside pocket of my coat when I left Idaho City in the spring of last year. I had it there the day I crossed back into Oregon. I had it there the first 3 towns I asked in. And then one morning in a boarding house in La Grande, I reached into that pocket, and the letter was not there. And I have never in my life been able to account for its going. I have looked in every coat I own. I have written back to every landlady I have stayed with. It is not anywhere I can find it. I have spent the last 20 months asking in every town on my run whether anyone knew of a Norwegian widow named Alvestad in the Palouse country, and no one did because I had the name only in the English spelling he wrote it, and the ranch hands in this county say your name in a manner that does not match the letters. And then 2 nights ago, my axle broke in a place I have crossed 100 times, and I walked in the wrong direction for 6 hours in the worst storm I have ever known. And I saw a light on a hill that I had never seen a light on before. And I walked to it, and when I woke this evening, the first thing my eyes fell on was my friend's Bible on your shelf. And I understood that a debt I had thought I would carry to my grave had been given back to me. I have brought you no letter. I am sorry for that. I have brought you only what he told me to tell you, and it is thin recompense for 2 years of your not knowing. Sigrun did not answer for a long time. When she did, her voice came out level plain, the voice of a woman who has been given at very long last, the specific piece of information her whole life had been waiting to align around. Mr. Kettleman, she offered, if you had brought me that letter 3 years ago, I would have taken it, and I would have wept over it, and I would have kept living in the leaking cabin down in the valley, because I would have believed that grief was the whole of what he had left me. You bring me his message tonight in a wagon he bought me before I knew I would need it on the same hill where he told a stranger in Idaho that I would one day stand up. You have not brought me thin recompense. You have brought me the shape of the whole thing. I did not know I was standing inside a shape. I have been standing inside one the whole while, and I have been building it, and he has been building the matching half of it, and now we have met in the middle in a wagon on a ridge in a storm. That is not thin, Mr. Kettleman. That is the whole width of a marriage. You go back to sleep. Your fingers need the sleep. We will talk again in the morning. Rufus Kettleman closed his eyes. He did not sleep at first. He heard Sigrun get up from the crate and cross to the stove and add one small piece of wood and cross to the shelf and take the Bible down from it and sit again on the crate with the book in her lap and open it to the flyleaf and read the writing there for a long time in silence. He heard her whisper her husband's name once quiet without weeping. Then he heard her close the book and set it on the crate beside her, and he heard her say to no one that he could see a sentence that would stay with him for the rest of his own life. Halvard, we built the same house. You built it there and I built it here, and the roof met tonight in the dark. Rest now, I have it from here. Then Rufus Kettleman slept. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. Not all at once. The wind died first in the small hours, and by dawn there was only a thin high drift of snow coming down straight out of a sky that was beginning at the edges to think about clearing. Sigrun opened the door for the first time in 92 hours. The world outside was a white she did not entirely recognize. The drifts came halfway up the wagon on the north side. The cellar hatch was buried. The path she had cut down to the spring the previous week was gone completely. It did not matter. What mattered was that the sky was quieting, and Rufus's third fingertip had stayed black, and the 2 children behind her were warm and fed, and a stranger by the stove was breathing steady, and the wagon around all of them had held. The first knock at the door after the wind died came from a family Sigrun did not know. A father, a mother, 4 children. The youngest of them, a girl of perhaps 5, with her cheeks the color of raw meat from 3 hours of walking in the wind. Their sod-roofed cabin 4 miles east had collapsed under the weight of the snow in the middle of the second night, and they had spent the storm huddled in the root cellar under the ruin, and when the wind had died they had walked because the light on Meadowlark Ridge was the light everyone in the valley had begun to walk toward now, whether or not they had ever spoken to the widow at the top of it. Sigrun took them in. She sat the little girl closest to the stove. She gave the mother a cup of broth and a corner to sit in, and she gave the father a task, because a father who has just watched his roof come down needs a task more than he needs sympathy, and she set him to breaking apart the last of the crates for kindling. 2 more travelers arrived by mid-morning, a pair of ranch hands from the Whitfield spread further south who had been caught out in the storm trying to bring in a scattered bunch of yearlings and had spent the last 2 nights in a snow cave. They had cut into a drift and who had walked when the wind fell in whatever direction their frozen legs had chosen for them, and whose direction had turned out to be Meadowlark Ridge, because Meadowlark Ridge had smoke coming out of a stovepipe in a country where nothing else did. Sigrun took them in. She fed them. She had Kirsten check their fingers and their toes, and she had Tori keep the fire going, and by noon there were 11 people packed into a wagon built for 2, and it was warmer inside than it had been the night before because the warmth of 11 bodies added to the warmth the walls already knew how to hold. Obadiah Renfrew arrived last in the middle of the afternoon on a borrowed horse from a neighbor whose stable had not fallen down. He climbed the trail on foot leading the horse because the trail was drifted too deep for a mount to make the last quarter mile. He arrived with 2 loaves of dark bread in a canvas sack over his shoulder and a jar of blackberry, preserves the widow. At the crossroads had pressed on him for the widow on the ridge, and he stopped in the doorway of the wagon, and he looked at the 11 souls arranged around the stove, in whatever posture the small space permitted, and his tired face did the small quiet thing it did when he was moved in a way he did not have the words for. "An ark, Mrs. Alvestad," he offered. "That is what you have built here. I did not know it while you were building it. I know it now." Sigrun handed him a cup of coffee. She looked around her small wagon. She saw Adeline's baby brought up the hill that morning by a Coburn cousin because Adeline herself was down with a chill, and Samuel had asked whether the wagon would hold one more infant for 2 days. She saw the collapsed roof family, the 4 children curled together on the pallet like puppies. She saw the 2 Thorncastle ranch hands sitting shoulder to shoulder against the wool-packed wall drinking coffee out of 2 of her 3 surviving cups. She saw Rufus Kettleman on the crate by the stove, his bandaged hands folded in his lap, watching the room with the quiet attention of a man who had 3 days before been ready to lie down in a snowbank and stop walking. She saw her own 2 children moving between the visitors as if they had been born innkeepers, offering water, adjusting blankets, doing the 1,000 small tasks of a household without needing to be told what any of the tasks were. An ark, she offered back quiet, that would be the word for it. Yes. She turned to her stove. She poured Obadiah his 2nd cup. She said nothing else. The old pastor did not require anything else. The next knock came on the morning after the pastor's arrival, and it was different from any of the knocks that had come before. It was hard. It was fast. It was the knock of a man who had ridden a horse to within an inch of the animal's life to get to the door, and Sigrun knew who it was before she reached the latch. She opened. Barnaby Thorncastle stood on the step. He had no hat. His hair, ordinarily kept in an iron-gray order by his wife's own comb, was wild around his face. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had used up every polite word he owned somewhere back down the trail, and he did not waste any of what remained on greeting. "Mrs. Alvestad, my wife is in labor, 2 weeks early. The child has turned wrong. The midwife is at her sister's confinement in Milton and cannot come. The doctor is snowed in on the wrong side of the low crossing, and the crossing is still underwater. My house has been cold for 4 days because the great chimney lost its draw in the storm, and I have burned every stick of wood on the place, and I cannot bring the bedroom above 60 degrees. My wife is bleeding. I do not know what to do. Mrs. Alvestad, I do not know what to do." Sigrun did not ask a single question. She reached for her coat. She pulled the small canvas satchel down from the peg where it had hung since March, the satchel that held her grandmother's scissors, and her grandmother's oiled thread, and her grandmother's small brown bottle of camphor, and the clean folded cloth she had washed and rewashed every month for 18 months, against exactly this hour, without knowing whose hour it would turn out to be. She spoke to Kirsten without looking at her, watch them all. Every one of them. Keep the stove going. Keep the door closed. Feed Rufus when he wakes. Do not open the door for anyone you do not know by sight. Kirsten nodded. Tori was already handing Sigrun her scarf. Sigrun turned to Rufus, who was awake watching. "Mr. Kettleman, my children are in your keeping until I return." Rufus Kettleman, whose right hand was still bound in muslin and whose left could not close entirely around the tin cup he was holding, straightened his back against the wall as if he had been given a commission by a general. "Ma'am," he offered, "with my life." Sigrun nodded once. She followed Barnaby out into the white. They went down the hill together, Barnaby breaking a path through the drifts with the shoulder of his horse, Sigrun coming after with her satchel held against her chest. The 2 of them not speaking, because there was nothing to say that would arrive at the Thorncastle house any faster than their legs would carry the news of them. The horse foundered twice in the deeper drifts and had to be pulled through. Barnaby's boots filled with snow. Sigrun's skirts froze stiff against her ankles. Neither of them stopped. They reached the great house on the flats a little before noon. The Thorncastle house was 2 stories of good milled lumber with a stone chimney at either end and a wraparound porch and glass windows in every room. And it was, as Barnaby had said, cold, not merely cool. Cold in the specific way a large house goes cold when the fires that have warmed it were never adequate to the volume of air the walls contained. Sigrun understood walking through the front hall why Percy had nearly gone from a fever that another child in a smaller house would have thrown off, and why Millicent, having spent a whole winter in this beautiful cold, had come to look for the widow on the hill with her son in her arms. The house was a monument to the idea that fire was what warmed a family. Sigrun had known better since she was 7 years old. Millicent was in the upstairs bedroom at the end of the hall. There were 2 women with her, both of them Thorncastle servants pressed into service because there was no one else, and both of them were out of their depth in a way that showed in the tight, worried angle of their shoulders. Millicent was pale. Millicent was sweating. Millicent's dark hair, always so carefully pinned, was loose across the pillow in wet ropes, and when Millicent saw Sigrun in the doorway, her whole face broke open in a manner Sigrun had seen only once before on Adeline Coburn's face in the doorway of a wagon 2 months earlier. "You came," Millicent offered, her voice thin. "I did not know if you would." Sigrun set her satchel on the bedside table. She stripped off her coat. She rolled up her sleeves. She washed her hands in the basin one of the servants had brought her in water she had asked to have brought hot. "Of course I came, Millicent. I always come. Now listen to me. I am going to make this room smaller. I am going to make it warm. Then I am going to see what your child is doing, and we are going to talk it into doing something more sensible. Do you understand?" Millicent nodded. She could not manage more than the nod. Sigrun turned to the 2 servants. "You, bring me every quilt in this house that is not currently on a bed. You, bring me the largest rug in the parlor and 2 more from the hall. Now." Both women went. Sigrun crossed to the great cold fireplace at the near wall of the bedroom, and she looked up into the flue, and she saw at once what had happened. The storm had blown enough loose snow down the chimney to choke the draw, and every fire Barnaby had built for 4 days had been suffocating itself, trying to breathe past the pack. Barnaby had been feeding fuel to a fire that could not burn hot because it could not get air. She sent Barnaby to the roof. He did not argue. She sent him with a stove brush and a length of rope and instructions to run the brush down the flue as far as he could reach, and then to run it again and to keep at it until the smoke coming out of the chimney was clean smoke. And Barnaby Thorncastle, who had not been on a roof in 20 years, climbed the ladder without a word because the widow on the hill had told him to. By the time the servants came back with the rugs and the quilts, Sigrun had already begun to reduce the bedroom. She rolled the first rug tight and wedged it hard along the base of the door. She pinned the largest of the quilts across the whole of the outer wall with the tacks from Millicent's own sewing box, so that a second wall of cloth stood a hand's breadth in front of the true wall and trapped a layer of dead air between them, the way her grandmother's cabin had trapped dead air between its boards. She hung a second quilt across the window. She hung a third across the doorway from the hall so that any warmth the small fire could produce would not bleed out into the great cold hollow of the house. Within a quarter of an hour, the bedroom was measurably warmer, and within a half an hour, when Barnaby's brushing broke the ice pack out of the chimney and the fire finally caught proper draw, the room began at last to become the small, warm place Millicent's labor required. Sigrun turned to the bed. She spoke to Millicent in the low, steady tone she had used on Percy through 3 long nights. "Now, Millicent, let me see what your child is telling us." Millicent gave her body over to Sigrun's hands without embarrassment, because there was no room in the hour for embarrassment. Sigrun's hands, which had learned the old work of turning a stubborn child from her own grandmother 40 years in one country away, went about their business with a patience that had been earned in a great many kitchens and a great many bedrooms across a great many bad nights. The child had turned sideways in the womb. Sigrun found the small, hard curve of a shoulder where the crown of a head ought to have been, and she pressed slow and certain in a specific pattern her grandmother had shown her once on a doll made of stuffed muslin 60 winters before, and the child inside Millicent moved. Not much. Enough. The labor took 12 hours. It was hard. Sigrun did not leave the room. Kirsten, 6 miles away on the ridge, did not open the door to a soul that Sigrun had not named, and Tori banked the stove 3 times through the day at the intervals his mother had drilled into him, and Rufus Kettleman, whose bandaged hands could not do the work, but whose voice was steady, kept the collapsed roof children quiet with stories about a mule he had once owned in Nevada that had learned to open the latch of its own paddock in the wagon on the ridge held. And in the Thorncastle bedroom in the small warm cave Sigrun had built inside the cold house, Millicent worked, and Sigrun coached, and Barnaby sent out into the hall, because there was no room for a large man in the small warm cave, paste a stripe into the runner rug outside the door that would still be visible when spring came. The child came at 3 in the morning. A girl. Small but not too small. Pink. Loud from her first breath in a way that made both servants laugh out of pure relief. Sigrun cleaned her with warm cloths and wrapped her in the softest of Millicent's own nightgowns, because the baby's things were still in a trunk that had not been unpacked, and she laid the small warm bundle against her mother's chest, and she stepped back and let the two of them look at each other for the first time. Millicent looked. She looked. She counted the fingers. She counted the toes. She lifted the small hand and pressed it to her own lips. Then she looked up at Sigrun across the bed. Sigrun, she offered, her voice broken open in a way it had never been in company. Your daughter's name. The little one. The one you lost. What was her name? The room went still. The two servants stopped folding towels. Barnaby, who had come back in as soon as the crying had started, stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and did not move. Sigrun did not answer at once. She had not said the name aloud in company since the March morning after the burial. She had said it to the wind in the field behind the cabin. She had said it to Kirsten once in the dark of the wagon. She had never said it to another grown woman in a lit room. She looked at the small living child on Millicent's chest. She looked at Millicent's tired, open face. She let the name come. Marit. Her name was Marit. Millicent nodded slow without letting her eyes leave Sigrun's. Then this child is Marit, she offered. I want my daughter to carry your daughter's name for as long as I live. Every time I say it, I will remember what a mother is. Every time she says it, she will be walking around inside a name that a widow on a hill gave back to me on the night my own child came. I do not ask your permission, Sigrun. I only ask that you know it is done. Sigrun pressed the flat of her hand against her mouth. The tears came the way they had come in the wagon the night Rufus had told her about Idaho, slow and steady past her fingers and down the back of her wrist. She did not lift the hand to catch them. Barnaby crossed the room. He did not touch her. He put his hand, one large, heavy, warm hand, on the shelf of Sigrun's shoulder, and he left it there. And he did not say a word, because there was no word available to a man in that room. In that hour that would have improved on the pressure of a hand. And Barnaby Thorncastle, whatever else the country had ever accused him of, had learned in the last 2 months to know when the pressure of a hand was the whole of what was owed. Sigrun walked home in the gray dawn on foot alone because she had refused a horse. She wanted the walking. She wanted the 6 miles of snow between the Thorncastle house and Meadowlark Ridge to give her time to arrive back at herself before she arrived back at her children. The world was very white in the new morning. The sky had cleared, and the sun, when it came over the eastern rim, laid a light across the drifts that made a person shade her eyes. Sigrun did not shade hers. She walked with her face lifted, and she said her daughter's name out loud once into the white air. Marit. The name went out over the snow. The wind gentle now took it and carried it, and Sigrun understood walking that the name would not any longer be a stone she carried in her pocket. The name would be a word other women would say in a farmhouse. She would never see at a supper table where a small girl with dark hair, like her mother's, would grow up answering to it. The name would live on other tongues than her own. That she understood at last was what her grandmother Ragnhild had meant by patience. Patience was not the endurance of a long silence. Patience was the willingness to lay down a name, a piece of knowledge, a way of packing a wall, and to trust that it would be picked up by hands you would never meet and carried into rooms you would never enter, and given in some hour long after your own hour was finished to the exact child who would need it. She reached the ridge a little before noon. Kirsten was at the door before Sigrun had cleared the last drift. Mother, is she all right? Is the baby? Both. Both are all right. Both are living. Kirsten's face did the small, careful thing it did when she was pleased, which was less than a smile and more than a nod, and she stepped aside to let her mother in. The wagon was warm. The wagon was full. The collapsed roof family had already begun the walk back down toward the ruins of their sod cabin, taking with them a canvas sack of dried meat and a smaller sack of Sigrun's precious yarrow, and the promise from Samuel Coburn, sent up by messenger, that his forge would begin work on new nails for their rebuild in the morning. The two ranch hands had gone back to the Thorncastle spread with a message from Barnaby that they were to be given hot beef and the run of the bunkhouse and no work for 2 days. Adeline's baby had gone home with the Coburn cousin. Only Rufus remained propped by the stove, where he had been the morning before, his bandaged hands folded, watching Sigrun cross her own threshold with the specific attention of a man who had spent a night guarding something not his own and was pleased to be able to hand it back intact. "Ma'am," he offered, all present. "Nothing broken. Boy fed the stove at every hour you named. Girl kept the door as instructed." I told them exactly one story I have not told anyone in 20 years, and I do not intend ever to tell it again. It was a mule story. Your children are polite listeners. That is not a small thing, in my experience. Sigrun looked at him. She looked at her children. She looked at the stove and the wall and the shelf with the Bible on it, and she felt the whole small kingdom of her wagon come back into focus around her. And she offered Rufus the closest thing to a smile her face had done in 3 years, "Mr. Kettleman. If you would care to stay a further week while your hand mends and the roads open, my son would consider it a personal favor." He has never in his life had a grown man teach him a proper knot. Halvard did not live long enough. If you know any knots you would be willing to pass on, I would take it as a kindness. Rufus Kettleman looked at Tori across the wagon. Tori at the far end looked back small and grave and hopeful, in a way 7-year-old boys try very hard not to show. Rufus nodded slow. "I know 6 knots, ma'am. I will teach him all 6. Then I will teach him the one my own father taught me, which is not a good knot, but is a family knot. And I will teach it to him for reasons that will make no sense to him at the time, but will make sense in about 30 years when he has a son of his own." Sigrun nodded. "That will do, Mr. Kettleman. That will do very well." The winter did not go easy. The valley had never seen a winter like that one, and it would not see another for the rest of the lives of everyone then living. Cattle died in the drifts. Fences that had stood since the 70s came down in stretches half a mile long. 2 families lost their houses to fire in January when the pipes on badly banked stoves let go, and 3 old people died in their beds in cabins that had not been packed the way Sigrun had begun teaching people to pack them. But no child in the Palouse country died that winter of the cold. Not one. Adeline Coburn wrote that fact down in her cloth-bound notebook in April. In her careful schoolteacher hand, on a page she titled simply, "Winter of '84, and she underlined the sentence twice, because the sentence was the whole of what mattered. By February 23, cabins between the ridge and the river had walls packed with raw wool. By March 41. By the time the last of the snow went off the north face of Meadowlark Ridge in the second week of April, there was not a farmhouse in 3 townships that had not received either a visit from Sigrun herself or a visit from a woman who had received a visit from Sigrun. The knowledge moved along the pattern Ragnhild had described 60 winters earlier. Along the pattern, Halvard had built the matching half of in Idaho. Along the pattern, all such knowledge moves along. When it is finally released from a single pair of hands, it went, and it kept going, and it did not stop. Barnaby Thorncastle rode up the ridge on a warm afternoon in the last week of April. He did not come with any paper this time. He came with a rolled deed in a small polished wooden box, and he stopped his horse at the low stone wall Sigrun and Tori had built along the front edge of the clearing over the previous 3 Sundays, and he dismounted, and he removed his hat, and he waited to be invited forward. Sigrun came out to meet him. "Mr. Thorncastle, Mrs. Alvestad." He set the deed on the flat top of the stone wall. He set the box beside it. He looked at her, and he offered in the voice of a man who had rehearsed the sentence for a week and still did not entirely trust it to come out right. "Meadowlark Ridge is yours, the whole of it, from the trail at the base to the far side of the north shoulder. It was always yours. I bought it in '79 from a man who did not want it, and I let it sit for 10 years. And in that time your husband bought a broken wagon and put it on it, and you built a house out of the wagon, and my son is alive because of that house, and my wife is alive because of that house, and my daughter is alive because of that house. I have owed you this deed since December. I have kept it in a drawer since December because I was ashamed to bring it and pretend it was payment. It is not payment. There is no payment for what you did. It is only what should have been true all along. The box is nothing. The box is a pair of good scissors my mother used that my wife and I want you to have because you did the work my mother would have wanted done. That is all. I will leave both here on this wall and I will go home. You do not owe me any word today." He turned, he mounted, he rode down the hill. Sigrun stood at the wall and watched him go. She did not open the box until she was inside the wagon alone at the crate, with the door closed and the children at the spring, and the pastor's borrowed horse tied to the post outside, because Obadiah Renfrew had come up for coffee and was walking the perimeter of the cellar with an old man's careful curiosity. She opened the box. The scissors inside were good German steel worn smooth at the finger loops by 40 years of a woman's hand. They fit Sigrun's hand exactly. She closed the box. She placed it on the shelf above the stove beside Halvard's Bible and Winifred Price's small enameled tin of candles, and she stood there for a moment looking at the shelf, at the three objects on it, at the small, careful record of what the last 8 months had made of her life. Then she went out to help the pastor down out of the cellar, because Obadiah at 71 had begun to have trouble with steps. The women came all through the spring and the summer and the following fall. They came in ones and twos and sometimes in small parties of 4 or 5, brought by other women who had already come. They came from Umatilla County and from Union County, and once from as far as Walla Walla across the state line, because word had crossed the state line the way word will when it is carrying something a body actually needs. Sigrun taught them all. She taught them in the wagon standing at the small stove with wool in her hands. She taught them out in the clearing, walking them around the perimeter of the cellar, and showing them how to lay river stones in the specific spiral pattern that kept the roots from freezing even when the ground above went hard. She taught them the sealing of doors and the packing of walls and the banking of stoves, and she taught them the smoking of fish and the drying of venison and the burying of carrots in dry sand. And she taught them, most of all, the thing her grandmother had never quite put into words, but had shown her by the way she had lived, that a door had 2 purposes, that it closed to keep out what did not belong, and it opened to admit what did, and that a woman who understood the difference between the 2 purposes had understood the whole of what a house was for. Kirsten grew that summer in the way girls of that age grow, 1.5 inches between June and September, and she began to help her mother teach. She stood at Sigrun's elbow when the visitors came, and she demonstrated the carding of wool for the ones whose hands had not yet learned it, and she showed the younger children how to pack the small hard spaces under a windowsill where a grown woman's fingers would not reach. Tori took to the outdoor work. He built with Rufus Kettleman's help during the 3 weeks Rufus stayed on to teach him knots, a small proper woodshed at the north side of the wagon, and he began to keep it stocked with such absorbed seriousness that Sigrun sometimes stood in the doorway of the wagon and watched him, and did not know whether to laugh or to weep, because the set of his small shoulders as he stacked was the exact set of his father's shoulders across a table in a Minnesota boarding house 16 years before, and she had not remembered until she saw it in her son that Halvard had once stacked exactly that way. Rufus went back to his freight run in the 2nd week of May with 2 functioning fingers on his right hand and a stub where the middle one had been, and a promise from Sigrun that any night his route brought him within 5 miles of Meadowlark Ridge, there would be a lantern in the window and a bowl on the stove. I kept the promise. He came 4 times a year for the rest of his working life, always in the direction he called east, always at dusk, always for 1 night only. And Tori, growing up under those visits, learned 6 knots and then 7, and then the family knot. Rufus had promised and understood by the time he had a son of his own exactly what Rufus had meant. Millicent Thorncastle came up the hill on the first Sunday of every month for the rest of her life. She brought her small daughter Marit with her from the moment the child was old enough to travel, and later she brought 2 more children, both of them boys, and she sat on the crate in Sigrun's wagon with her coffee, and she talked plainly and without hats about the small matters of the valley, and Sigrun listened and answered, and the 2 of them grew over the years into the sort of friendship that only forms between women who have watched each other in the hour of the greatest fear a woman can know and have found each other equal to it. When Millicent's Marit was 7 years old, she asked her mother one afternoon plainly why she had been given her name. Millicent told her the whole story. The child listened. The child, when Millicent had finished, sat quiet for a long moment, and then she offered in the specific, careful voice of a 7-year-old who has understood a thing larger than she quite has words for, "Then I will try to be worthy of it, Mama." Millicent did not answer. She only pulled the child into her lap and held her. Sigrun lived on Meadowlark Ridge for another 31 years. She never remarried. She told Adeline once in the late 90s over coffee in the wagon that had by then grown a small proper addition on the south side to serve as a summer kitchen. Already had the marriage a woman was entitled to in one lifetime, and she was not going to be greedy. She kept teaching. She kept the wagon. When Kirsten married a decent young farmer named Peter Isaacson from the far side of the ridge in 1892, Sigrun gave them the wagon as a wedding gift, and Kirsten and Peter moved into it and raised their own 3 children in it, while they built a proper house at the foot of the ridge, And when the proper house was finished, they moved into it, and the wagon stayed on the ridge, and Sigrun stayed in it alone entirely by her own choice, until the winter of 1915, when she died quietly in her sleep on a cold, clear night, with the stove banked exactly the way she had taught it to be banked, and the door sealed exactly the way she had taught it to be sealed, and her grandmother's scissors on the shelf beside her husband's small black Bible. Tory by then was a grown man of 38, married with 4 children of his own. He took the Bible. Hein gave the scissors to his sister. The wagon he left where it stood because his mother had asked him to, and it stood on the ridge for another 60 years, and children of the valley grew up climbing on it, and knowing it as the widow's wagon, and grandmothers pointed it out to grandchildren, and told a story that grew in the telling into the specific shape a true story takes when it has passed through enough hands to become useful to strangers. Many years after all of this, in a small warm house at the foot of Meadowlark Ridge, a young woman stood in her own kitchen with her hands full of raw wool. She was Kirsten's great-granddaughter. She had her great-great-grandmother's hair the same specific pale color it had been in the September morning of 1884, and she had her great-great-grandmother's hands steady, patient, in the way patience meant when Ragnhild had first said the word into a small palm in a Minnesota cabin. On the shelf above her stove sat 2 things. One was a small black Bible with the corners worn soft. The other was a photograph in a plain wooden frame taken in Pendleton in the summer of 1910 by a traveling photographer who had insisted on making a widow of 60 sit for a portrait that she stopped working long enough to hold still, a woman with silver hair pulled back, plain eyes the color of a lake at dusk, mouth set in the small, quiet expression of a person who had not in her long life been in any particular hurry to smile for a camera. The young woman glanced at the photograph. She turned back to her work. Her own daughter, 4 years old, stood on a wooden stool beside her, pushing small handfuls of wool into the low spaces where a grown woman's fingers would not fit. The child was named Marit. It was the 3rd Marit in the family in 3 generations, and the young mother had not chosen the name so much as accepted it, because in this family that name meant a specific thing, and had for as long as anyone had been keeping count. Mama the child offered one small hand pressed flat against the packed inner wall. The wall is warm. There isn't any fire yet. The young mother crouched down beside her daughter. She placed her own hand flat over the child so that both palms lay together against the warm wool. Yes, my love, she offered. There isn't any fire yet. The child looked up, puzzled and pleased. Then how is it warm? The young mother took her time answering. She had answered the question before for older children and for younger ones, and she had learned that the answer did not so much need to be right as it needed to be given in the voice her own great-grandmother had once used with her when she had asked the same question at the same age. Men build houses with fire, she offered little Marit. That is one way. Women build houses with patience. That is the other way. Your great-great-grandmother learned that from her grandmother, and she taught it to your great-grandmother, and your great-grandmother taught it to your grandmother, and your grandmother taught it to me, and now I am teaching it to you. And one day when you have a daughter of your own, you will teach it to her. That is how the warmth stays alive after we are gone. Do you understand? The child, 4 years old, thought about it. Then she nodded slow, the specific nod that runs in this family, the same nod her great-great-grandmother had given Dr. Silas Whitcomb in the doorway of a leaking cabin in the March of 1883. Yes, Mama, she offered. I understand. The young mother pulled her daughter into her lap. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to come down over Meadowlark Ridge, slow and steady, the friendly kind, the kind that means only winter and not disaster. In the kitchen, the wall held. It would hold. It had been built to. If you have stayed with this story to the end, thank you. Sigrun Alvestad never wrote a book. She never gave a speech. She never asked to be remembered. But her story leaves us with 3 things worth carrying home. The first is this: you are stronger than you know. Sigrun had no husband. She had no money. She had no help. She had a hammer, 2 children, and a promise she had made in a muddy field to a daughter she could not save. With those 3 things, she saved a whole valley. When life takes everything from a woman, what is left is often more than she was ever told. The second is this: forgiveness is not forgetting. It is choosing. Sigrun had every right to close her door on Millicent Thorncastle at the worst hour of that woman's life. Every right in the world. Millicent had mocked her from a saddle, had let her own daughter carry cruelty into a schoolyard, had said things in her own parlor that she could not unsay. When Millicent came to that door with a dying boy in her arms, Sigrun did not remember the mockery. She remembered that they were both mothers. That single choice remade both of their lives and every life in that valley after them. The third is this: nothing we know is truly our own. The knowledge that saved those children did not begin with Sigrun. It came from a grandmother in a cold Minnesota cabin, was carried across a continent by a man dying quietly in an Idaho boarding house, passed through the hands of one widow on one ridge to the women of one small valley, and from them to their daughters, and from their daughters to daughters not yet born. What we learn from those who loved us is meant to be given away. That is the only way the warmth stays alive after we are gone. So if this story reminded you of a mother, a grandmother, an aunt, a neighbor woman who taught you something you still carry, leave her name in the comments below. Someone else may need to hear the story of her. And if you have your own quiet hill, your own hard winter, your own door that no one else believes will hold, remember this. Men build houses with fire. Women build houses with patience. And the wind to this day is still looking for a way in.